Good morning, and welcome everyone to our first largely in-person meeting of the board for over 2 years. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here and welcome all of you in the room and also those board colleagues that we have online joining us in our first fully hybrid meeting. Thank you for your waves. Can I remind all of us of the normal etiquette when we're in a meeting, which is also going to be available online? If we can speak clearly, both for the minute and for those listening, ideally when asking your question, if you can point your word towards the camera, that would be really helpful for those who are going to be able to hear. Can you also indicate really clearly in the room if you would like me to bring you in? It's been a while since I've had anything other than the electronic hands indicating that people would like to come in, and I'm going to be keeping an eye on the screen too, so please indicate clearly and we will feel our way through this. We've got a fairly busy agenda today, and I'm really delighted that we're able to welcome some new people to join us as we work our way through that. We've got a new ACO, Andy Watt, who is currently in the training, safety and assurance. Many of you will know Andy from previous attendance at the board and other roles, but this is his first formal meeting as ACO. And we've got temporary ACOs, David Lockhart, who again, many of you will have met in other roles, but is joining us within his SLT role too. And David's the Director of Service Development and Delivery?
That's correct. Development.
Development. I'm giving you an extra. Extra You're already long. Yes. So welcome both, and I know that we've got other colleagues joining us around the table too. Lynn, you're going to be joining us for the whole meeting. Lynn, your full title is Head of Finance and Procurement.
That's correct, thank you.
Yes, and it's the first time we've met in person.
Yes, yes, it's nice to see people in person.
Good. We've got a few apologies. We've got apologies from the Chief and from the Deputy Chief, and in their absence, Stuart Stevens is going to be supporting us from a service delivery perspective. Also, we've got apologies from John Thompson, who's having a long awaited and very deserved holiday. So we're really pleased that we've got a great turnout, but the people are also able to take their leave. Consideration of and decision on any items to be taken in private. We do have some items that are going to be in private later on. The main one being control command futures. I'm presuming that we're all content that that is one that we keep in private. And I'm asking for your support that everything else on the agenda should be heard in public. Was there anything on the agenda that anybody thought should be in private? No. Okay, lovely. So we'll keep the agenda as it is. Into declarations of interest. Any interest to declare? No. If any emerge through the process, please let me know and we will deal with them according to our code of conduct. Minutes of the previous meeting, 28th of April, those are attached. Can I ask you please to refer to those and flag any amendments, additions or changes that we think we need to make to those before we approve them as an accurate record? Anything at all, or are we content that those are accurate and complete? Fiona, please.
Fiona Thorburn, board member. It was really a question around 13.2. So this is around the board asking whether the intention was to have one plan which captured the change elements, interdependencies, etc. We've talked about that a few times, and I was just looking for a rough time scale as to when we would have one plan, i.e. an AOP that has the change elements in it as well.
Yes, that's a good question. Mark, will be able to assist with that.
Well, as you know, Fiona, Mark Mackett's here, Director of Strategic Planning, Performance and Communications. So as you know, Fiona, we've extended the AOP through to October as we consult upon the strategic plan. So the intention is from October onwards, that's when we start to bring the consolidated plan together. So there's work underway behind the scenes
Okay.
to begin to bring all that together.
So a consolidated plan we might expect.
So we'll start to have
roughly?
discussions over the course of the rest of the summer with the board. So we'll programme that in,
Okay.
and then we'll present that to the board in kind of publication, if you like, in October. So.
Oh, right. Okay. Good. Thank you.
Leslie, you'd indicated.
Thank you, Leslie Bloomer, board member. I'd noted this point in the minutes as well, and it links to a point in the minute of our discussion of the strategic plan, which was conducted in private last time. And in the minute of the discussion on the strategic plan, we note that we are looking to go to one plan, which is AOP, change and business as usual. And I think the Deputy Chief Officer in that discussion confirmed that that was what we were looking at.
Yes.
I just wanted to confirm that was the position.
So we can officially pick that up in the minute of the private session, but I do see the connection between the two.
Thank you, Kirsty.
And thank you, board colleagues, for remembering to introduce yourself, and other exec colleagues introducing yourselves for the benefit of those observing. We can make sure that that additional aspect is reflected in the current minutes so that we can follow that process through. Anything else that we need to raise either as a matter arising on that, or are we content now to record that as accurate? Okay, so that's those minutes through. Thank you very much. Action log. Ali, can you support us with that, please?
Thank you, Chair. Group Commander Ali Cameron, Board Support Manager. So just to confirm that the Board are content with the rolling action log, you will see that there are 6 actions in total, all of which have been marked blue as completed. So just in relation to position statements, that there's no further comment to be made, and you're happy for these to be removed accordingly. Thank you, Chair.
Content on that basis for those to be removed and for that to be agreed?
Thank you, Chair. Moving on to item 7, the decision log. So again, just confirming that the board are content with the impact assessment for board decisions in the review of the 27th of May 21 meeting and the 24th of June 21 meeting, reflecting back over the last 12 months. Thank you.
Content, lovely. Thank you very much, colleagues. That takes us into my chair's report, and you will have seen that a copy of my activity over the last couple of months is recorded within the papers. Just a few things that I wanted to flag, both from that and more widely. So you'll note that I was involved in a reference group for the appointment of the Director of Safer Communities within Scottish Government. And for those of you who may not have heard through other networks, Don McGilvray, who was the interim director, has been appointed permanently into that role. So can we welcome him into that new post? That's a key role within the civil service for us. So it's we've got a degree of continuity there in an existing relationship, which is to be welcomed. I also had the great pleasure of being able to attend some long service good conduct awards. I was able to attend in the city of Dunfermline the very morning it became a city. That was our first long service good conduct that we've had for a very long time. And apart from the fact that I probably got COVID that day when I was attending, it was an extremely positive event. And I mean, it's a great pleasure to be able to do these face-to-face. People really appreciate them, and it was fabulous. I also was able to attend one in Aberdeen and Dundee, and again, they were really successful events. It wasn't just long service good conduct. There were also some Chief Fire Officer awards and some Braveheart awards and other recognitions done on those days. And I was able to give closing remarks at those, and I was actually quite caught and struggled to give some of my closing remarks on a couple of those occasions when I was able to hear some of the bravery and courage of members, ordinary members of the public, and some off-duty retained firefighters who had gone so far beyond what would be expected of ordinary behaviour, you know, literally running into smoke-filled buildings and dragging people out who almost certainly would have died without that. One retired firefighter off duty, not only did that, he went back into the building which was full of smoke to remove gas canisters because he was aware of the risk of an exploding gas canister to bystanders and to his firefighter colleagues who were already on their way. There was also a young man who had been able, a very young man, who had been able to evacuate his family from a smoke-filled building also. And the pride, the young man was quite, combination I think, maybe being a little overwhelmed with being, why is people making so much fuss over me when I did something sensible, but the pride in his parents' faces was just outstanding. So it's really fantastic that we're able to do these again and to mark them. The other thing that I wanted to comment on were the Njc negotiations. I'm going to speak more about the Njc facilitated negotiations in Scotland in our private section update, but I can let you know that we have met, and more widely than that, for those of you who may not have seen the announcement, the Njc in the UK have made a pay offer to firefighters. That offer is a UK-wide offer and it was at 2%. I think we are all clear that that is not what firefighters deserve in Scotland or in the UK. It massively underrepresents their value. However, it is the amount that was considered affordable across UK fire and rescue services. And I think probably unsurprisingly, the FBU have recommended that for rejection and are indicating that there may be industrial action considerations following from that. It is, however, currently out to ballot or going out to ballot for members, so we will await the result of that. But I don't think it's surprising that this has not been particularly well received, and that of course is regrettable for many reasons. I'm content that I've reflected on the 2 or 3 things in my diary that I think are important, but there may well be other things, items that you want to ask questions about or raise with me, so I'll hesitate at that in case there's anything else people want to pick up. No? Okay, thank you. So that's noted. We now move into the Deputy Chief Officer's report, and in Ross Haggart's absence, Stuart Stevens is going to speak to that.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, colleagues. As the Chair said, it's really good to see everybody in person this morning. The DEP's diary is provided, and I'm happy to expand upon any points within it if I'm able to do so. The only point that I would like to raise this morning is in regard to the recently published resource spending review from Scottish Government. Clearly, they've now published that, and it sets out a 4-year indicative budget of flat cash over this period. Based on current known factors and taking into account what the Chair just said in terms of the Njc price, this equates to roughly about 24 million for the budget over that period. So SLT have discussed this at length, and now individual directorates are now developing potential options in response to this. We will meet again in mid-July to discuss this and start to formulate a programme of work in response. This will be shared and developed along with the board over the coming months, and then subsequently developed into a formal programme of work. I think I need to be clear that this will be exceptionally challenging in terms of the outcome of the resource spending review, and there'll be some difficult choices that need to be made over the coming years. These decisions will be based on risk and underpinned by robust evidence base. Throughout this process, we'll absolutely ensure that all our stakeholders and staff are engaged and supported throughout, and we'll also look for opportunities to explore further shared assets and collaborative options with our partners. So, Chair, that was the only item I wish to update on.
Fiona.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm just being nosy. There's an update on Monday, the 13th of June, introductory meeting with Morden Solutions. I just wondered, you might not know the answer. Yeah,
I can talk to that. So it's an executive quote that we have brought in, and some of the SLT have previously used those services. So given Ross's new appointment, he is undertaking.
I'd heard of them before and
executive
I
coaching.
wondered it,
Yeah.
right, okay, no, just checking it was the same folk, thank you.
Yes.
And that's Liz Barnes, Director of People and Organisational Development.
Sorry.
So right, I always forget. So I will to remind you, Brian.
Now that I've been reminded, Brian Baverstock, board member. Stuart, thanks for that reference to the resource spending review. It doesn't take us much of the meeting to make reference, as should be the case.
Absolutely.
And I just want to make the connection between those comments and the reference to planning earlier. And clearly, this needs to be worked through as a key element of those plans. And I'm not going to ask you for any details, but obviously the message to directorates in terms of the severity of that has been communicated. And it was just the assurance that the reality of that is really sinking through the organisation.
I believe it is, and that the DEP has put out a message to staff to set out the challenge associated with that. As I say, the work is now progressing in terms of developing those options, but I think there's an absolute understanding across the organisation around the magnitude of the challenge and the need to draw all our planning arrangements together in terms of SDNP, the strategic plan, things like that as well. So it really does change the narrative around the strategic plan.
Yeah. And although it's clearly not good news that, you know, in any such situation there is an opportunity, and I hope that is being communicated also.
Absolutely, and SLT discussed this yesterday. Whilst it's challenging, there is an opportunity to reform the organisation, both in terms of how the organisation looks in terms of its footprint, but also leadership, culture, and diversity and things like that as well. So there is a real opportunity to bring together all the things we've discussed into a single plan and programme of work.
Thank you.
Can I bring Mark in, please? I think, Mark, you're probably going to speak a little bit about the plan and the programme of work that might need to be undertaken to support some of this.
Yeah, so as Stuart said, you know, as directors, we're all off working with our heads of function, looking at potential options for savings. And that's just a patrol, so not coming to any decisions clearly. So the intention is that we'll have a whole timeline worked out for the board as part of the engagement process and decision-making process through all of that, Brian. So the intention would be we'd kick that off probably an extra strategy day in August. We're plugging that in at the moment, using our away days as well in October, and also an extra strategy day in September. But working it right through the timeline to April next year, where we need to get the budget set by the board and the programme of work for the 4 years thereafter cast out. And we'll bring all that together. So I'm working up the timeline with Stuart at the moment, and we'll get that shared out to the board as soon as we can. And then say the programme of meetings are getting looked at diaries at the moment. We'll have all of that together. So we'll essentially go through an exercise where we need to set some broad priorities from the board, so that we can then look at the options that we've started to have a look at. Where do they fit against those priorities? What saving potential does that realise for the service? What gap remains in that, and therefore where do we have to go? But just to be assured that, you know, the board will be heavily involved in that. I shared a rough draft of the timeline earlier in the week with Kirsty, but we'll get that out to you in the next week or so. We see how that programme of work is going to evolve over the next 6 months. But, you know, just to echo what Stuart says, you know, the challenge I think has already been started.
That's really
Really
helpful.
be felt by people. The day that the spending review was announced, we put out communications to staff. Here is the spending review, it's a flat cash, it's broadly what it means, and then we followed that up last week where Ross did a short video blog out to staff, just again re-emphasise there is a real challenge here, but be assured there's a programme of work. We will take control of this, and within that, and Stuart's rightly saying, there are also opportunities for the service. This is not all doom and gloom, but don't underestimate the challenge. I think that's going to be the core of the message there. We will take a programmed approach to this. We will take control of it. We will make some tough choices, we all know that. But the message to staff is we will take that measured and managed approach and work our way through this over the next 4 years.
That is really helpful, Mark, particularly that messaging to staff, because if it's an uncertain time for the board and the senior team, it's an uncertain time for the whole organisation.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So that's really good to hear.
Thank you. Stuart Ballingal on the stream.
Hey, good morning, Stuart Ballingal, board member. A previous chat we had about this, John Thompson indicated that this wasn't something that the organisation had been through before. I just was wondering and musing in my head around what experience have we got within the leadership team that has done this type of exercise before, and do we need to think about supplementing that?
I'll bring Stuart in, Stuart Stevens in initially.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Good morning. I think in terms of experience of doing something like this before, most of us went through the reform process in terms of bringing the 8 services into one, and this, to many regards, is very similar to that. It's taking quite a substantial amount out of the cost base and reforming the organisation. So I see this as a very similar approach to what was done then. And as I say, the majority of us have been through that. I think your point in terms of bringing in additional support is noted, and I think we need to have that discussion across SLT over the coming weeks in terms of what we might need to do in terms of bringing in additional support if required.
Let me just add to that, Kirsty, just again building Stuart's point for Stuart, that those savings that came from reform, Stuart, back in 2013, so they're recurring savings that run throughout the service, and for the 15 years, because that's what was programmed over as part of the business case for reform, it comes to somewhere in the region of £384 million out of the cost base of the service over that period of time. So we started back then with a strategic intent, which is essentially, I think, where we will go with the spending review. That then set the parameters for where those savings were to come from the organisation, and then the programme of work was built up round about that. So we'll more or less adopt that approach, but there is experience throughout the organisation going back to that period. And Ian, sitting here on my right, he was there right throughout that whole period. I came in just midway through the beginning of it, so there is some experience of going through this type of exercise across the organisation at senior level, just to give that reassurance.
Just to reinforce that, I support all of that, but also it's worth noting that part of the work that the directorates are doing is to prioritise the workload so that it can free up some of the resource. So the skills are there, but what we will need to do is make that resource available internally. So that's part of the work that we're doing when we're looking at how we approach this. So I feel comfortable, reinforcing what Stuart and Mark have said, that the skills are there, but it is about the volume of work and priorities. Fiona?
This is probably stating blindingly obvious, but there's clearly around the board table a fair bit of experience, which I know you won't tap into, but it's worth just saying that wherever any of us can help, clearly we would want to do so. So there's quite a mix of experience of this type of thing.
Absolutely, and actually reflects the conversation the chair and I had this morning exactly in that regard, around about tapping into the experience that sits around the board table as well, because I think it will be absolutely invaluable over the coming months.
Yeah, this has to be a collaborative effort, and we have collaborated as a board and an SLT previously, and I think the initial reform and strategic intent process in the early formative stages of this organisation put us in a good place for that. I think Lizzie's point's very well made, though. It is about freeing up the capacity to be able to do that work and to manage the change process. That is going to be the challenge for us. The skills are there, we just need to free it up. Mark?
I was just going to say, and that links back to, I think, Fiona's point from earlier when we were discussing the minute, that what we will need to do in light of the strategic plan, until we'll be prioritising within that, subject to the consultation exercise clearly, and then what will go into the programme of work has to now capture the reality of where we're going to be through the resource spending review. So probably the AOP come October isn't the AOP that we would have written 3 or 4 months ago. This now will be a substantial part of it. It's that reprioritisation that Liz is talking about.
Thank you. So that noted, it takes us into our committee reports, and the first committee report is the Change Committee. Fiona?
The minutes are there as ever, so happy to answer any questions. The kind of headline, and we've actually covered some of this, was there's ongoing resource challenges, and these have been coming through the portfolio reports for quite some time, and we discussed them. We inevitably started to talk about prioritisation, which we've already talked about, and the other major piece that we discussed at length, which fits into this same sort of context, is the people training, finance and assets system, which is a massive programme, and the committee expressed some concerns about its size, etc. but I actually feel this is kind of historical, what I'm saying here, given the resource spending review and also the conversation we've already had this morning. So happy to answer any questions on detail beyond that.
Any questions or comments, or again, just to me? Content? Lovely, thank you. Audit and Risk Assurance Committee, Brian.
Yep, thank you. There's two sets of minutes on the agenda. The 30th of March, I gave a verbal update of that meeting on the 31st of March to the board, so I don't intend to repeat that, but happy to take any questions. Our most recent meeting was yesterday, and there's a few things that I just want to highlight from that meeting. This is the meeting where we consider some key governance elements that go towards and contribute towards the annual report and accounts. We had the committee's own annual report that goes to the board and the accountable officer. We had the draft annual governance statement, and finally we had the annual report from internal audit, and they provide an opinion on their work for the preceding year. Happy to report that all of these documents concluded positively in terms of the arrangements for governance, risk and control across the organisation, which I think is a significant statement given the challenges across the organisation. So I think that the executive team need to be commended for the efforts that got us to that point. We did a chunk of stuff round about the work of internal audit. We had two reports. One was on the portfolio office, and given that the portfolio office is still in a state of development, the focus for the audit was more as an advisory function. So they were there to look at the developments and comment whether they thought that these developments were consistent with best practice. The report made some significant observations. It made 5 amber recommendations, which is the second highest, and the definition of that is that there's high risk exposure. So these, excuse me, are not insignificant, and we had quite a lengthy discussion on this report and what it meant, and the senior SLT, senior leadership team, have been asked to go away and consider a more fuller management response to that report, because I think that response needs to be a little bit more rounded than the very sort of specific one we received in the written report. So, that said and done, I mean, it's not entirely doom and gloom. I mean, none of the messages in the report came as any surprise to the organisation or indeed to the committee, but it was just a reminder of how important this is to the organisation, and in the context of the discussion that we've just had round about resource spending review, new planning, the change function, the change capacity in the organisation is critical to the future of the organisation, so we really do need to get this right. The second internal report was an investigation into an alleged, and I emphasise alleged, misappropriation of smoke detectors and a trauma bag, and we dealt with that in committee in private session, and I wouldn't want to say any more on that here, but I would like to say a little bit when we come to our private session later on, if that's okay. We looked again at the action plan that resulted from the external audit review of the organisation, and I'm pleased to say that work is on track and progressing well. And I would simply also note that Deloitte, who are our current external auditors, they will be with us until October. In October we will have Audit Scotland as our new auditors going forward for the next 5 years. That's just the standard rotation that happens with these things. As we always do at an audit committee, we talked about risk management, and the conclusion of that discussion was that we felt that there is a need to have a session, a workshop session, where we can look at the format of the reporting on risk to make sure that it's really optimal in terms of enabling the committee, not just the audit committee, but other committees, to exercise their kind of scrutiny role, because I think individually we're kind of struggling to see how we're getting the most out of that. And the last point that I would highlight is that we received that there's a National Fraud Initiative exercise undertaken each year as a standard for all public bodies. It compares data sets, and part of that comparison was to look at data sets on Companies House records to the employment database for the organisation, and unsurprisingly it came up with some matches. That in itself is not unusual, but the concern here was that that does constitute an interest. You know, the people concerned should be recording that interest through a process of self-declaration, and that's not being done. It's not being done routinely. Now, it may seem a fairly low-level issue, but it's not, and it could become a major issue. So the committee is keen to understand how we can increase our efforts to get staff across the organisation to understand the requirements of declaring interests, there being a proper process then to examine those interests, and where action is needed to be taken, it's taken. So, so that work is going to be looked at again to see if we can improve the effectiveness of that process. And that's it. Kirsty, happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Angelina.
Thank you. Angelina Foster, board member. So thank you for that readout. I find extremely helpful. In relation to the audit report on the portfolio office, as you know, I'm not on your committee, but have read that paper, so very much welcome the request for fuller management response. My specific question, though, is whether that report or the next iteration of work in this area is going to come at some point to the Change Committee as well, and will it be shared by both committees, or just a question around its little journey and its next stages?
Absolutely. I mean, it's not. I mean, audit reports are channeled through the audit committee, but on occasions like this, they will be considered by other relevant committees, and in truth, the substance of the issues sit better with the Change Committee.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Content to note.
Chair, Nick Barr.
Yes. Yeah, please, Nick, come in.
Hi, thank you, Chair. Nick Barr, board member, chair of the Service Delivery Committee, which is relevant to this question for Brian. Brian, you mentioned in your update that you were considering running a risk management workshop, if I heard you correctly. Was the intention for that to be purely for members of the Risk and Audit Committee, or was that going to be a wider invitation for perhaps chairs and other interested members of other committees?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I should have actually stated this, that the plan is that it will be for Audit Committee and chairs of the other committees. But I guess I didn't want to extend the invitation to the entire board, because I felt a tighter group would allow us to get to the issues much more easily, but certainly the intention is for other committee chairs to be included in that.
Thank you for the clarification. Thanks, Chair. That's my question complete.
Thank you. That noted, People Committee, and we're on screen with Mary.
Hello, Mary Wiley, Chair of the People Committee, board member. Just a few things to note. We obviously considered our annual value added statement at the committee. We also considered and agreed for recommendation the changes to the EPA terms of reference, and that's on the agenda today, so Steve will speak to that a little bit later. We did consider obviously the performance reports, and we do continue to welcome some of the changes that have been made that certainly make them, I think, more accessible and help to focus the committee's attention to certain key aspects. But one of the things that I just wanted to highlight, or two things I wanted to highlight, is we noted as well the success in regards to delivering training, particularly around competency training, which was very welcome. But also just really to draw particular attention to the fact that there were 0 RIDDER incidents in the last quarter of the year, and actually I think the board as a whole need to really congratulate all of the individuals involved in that. That's a significant achievement, so we were very welcoming of that as a committee. And we also scrutinised the health and safety report for 2020-2021, and that is of course on these papers for noting for the board as well. There was a bit of discussion around the time frame for the reporting of the health and safety report. Must the committee note obviously significant pressures around the COVID circumstances that we've experienced over the last couple of years. I think there was a general agreement that the health and safety report will come slightly earlier, and Andy's already on top of that, as you would expect. So I think we're assured that that will happen. We did talk about the mental health strategy, in particular the wellbeing champions. I think we took a lot of encouragement from the fact that there was an oversubscription, if that's the right way to phrase it, of interest in the role of becoming a wellbeing champion, far above what they anticipated. And again, that was really welcome. And I think that's a really encouraging sign around how people are thinking about mental health and wellbeing within the organisation too. And we took a really interesting input from Stuart, so thank you for that, Stuart, around the RDS. And it was a risk spotlight for ourselves. I think it's key to note that this is a wicked issue. There is no simple, straightforward solution to this. And so we do need to continue to keep a focus on it, but what we were was assured that the executive are very much aware of the issues, that the team standing behind them are working hard to try and address that. One of the key things that we highlighted, and there was agreement around the room, was that we need to learn from where things are working and make sure that we understand, I suppose, what's transferable to other areas and what's unique to those circumstances where it has worked that can't be replicated, and replicate what can. Off the back of some of or a number of items going through the reports and through the discussion, it was suggested that another spotlight for future would be around the control staff. Although we're experiencing significant challenges, I think, around recruitment, as are many places. It's not unique to the fire service, but there are unique aspects to the challenges within the control room that as a committee we just want to understand a little bit more, that go beyond the recruitment but also the retention period and the unique pressures that as a staff team that they experience, and just trying to understand them a bit more as well. And that's all I was planning on saying, Chair. I'm happy to take any questions in theory, although I may defer to other members of the committee to answer them if they're particularly difficult.
Thank you, Annie. Any comments or questions? Paul.
Paul Stallard, board member. Can I just endorse something that Mary's just said? I think for an organisation like ourselves to have no riddles in a quarter is an astonishing achievement. And I think the board should sort of formally just record praise of not just of the health and safety staff, but of the entire organisation. I think for a dynamic emergency service of our size to do that is pretty well, I'm not saying it's unique, but I think it must be quite remarkable.
Thank you, and thank you for flagging that. Okay, lovely, thank you. That noted, it's now the Service Delivery Committee and Nick Barr, supported by Stuart for part 2 of that, but you, Nick.
Thank you, Chair. The Service Delivery Committee met on the 31st of May. Thanks to Paul Stollard for joining us as a new member, and Malcolm Payton, who's now left. Thank you for your help, Malcolm, previously. We looked, as usual, on the Service Delivery Update report, including an interesting article around the marauding terrorist attacks and the flexi duty officers' new responding to that. Across all 3 SDAs, and generalised awareness training to all firefighters. So that was noted by the committee. Interesting that the chair of the People Committee should just talk about OC staff, and we too had some discussion on that, particularly around high rates of absence and retention, etc. So obviously it's an issue of concern across more than one committee. So I'll leave that now with the People Committee, but we were interested in it from an operational perspective on that occasion. The QPR report for the Q4 was discussed in some detail, and in particular we were looking at home fire safety visits, and we were looking at a broad range of things, but in one of those aspects was home fire safety visits, and we commissioned a deep dive report into home fire safety visits, so we can really grapple with some and discuss some of the deeper aspects of that complex situation, with particular respect to getting value for money and best bang for the buck where we target those vulnerable groups. We move there to the current HMFSI action plans, and we were pleased to note the closing report of the Fleet and Equipment Action Plan. We then also, under that generalised heading on the agenda, we scrutinised the work plan update for the preferred UFAS response model, and the committee did note the critical dependency on CCMS, and perhaps that may come up in discussion as we move forward through the meeting, and in particular into the private meeting. Under our operational learning section, we discussed clinical governance, and I've subsequently had a very productive conversation with a new director of training, safety and assurance, and we've agreed joint way forward on that, so that's extremely pleasing. As you mentioned, Stuart will be talking about Grenfell very shortly, but we're also pleased to welcome Dr. Stuart Nicholson from the NFCC's, well, from our own ranks, but also chairs the NFCC's National Operational Learning Group. And that was very insightful as to the workings at the national level of how learning and continuous improvement develops across the UK. We had under the climate change agreement, climate change agenda item, we talked about lithium-ion batteries and the implications to a firefighting service. That was a particularly interesting note, and we had also an informative briefing on high-rise firefighting. We look forward to our next meeting on the 30th of August. As I mentioned, home fire safety visits. We're also going to be looking at safe and well visits and trying to understand more thoroughly the detail involved with those. As a reminder to other members of the board who are not on the SDC, there's a standing invitation, as always, to join the meeting if we are discussing particular topics of interest for your own areas of work. If there are no questions, I'm happy to hand over to Stuart.
Any questions on that report before we move into Grenfell? Thank you. Noted. Stuart.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Nick. So presenting the board with the closing report, which relates to phase 1 recommendations from the Grenfell inquiry, and as Nick rightly says, this was presented to the Service Delivery Committee on the 31st of May for scrutiny, and it's been brought to the board for information. I'll perhaps start by highlighting the significant amount of work that the service has undertaken since the tragic event in June 2017. That not only includes the action plan that's attached today, but also the wider work which was done under the auspices of the Ministerial Working Group and the 3 subgroups which sat beneath those relating to fire safety regulatory framework, which was led jointly between the Scottish Government, Housing and the FRU. The Building Standards work, which was led by Paul Stollard, and the enforcement and compliance work, which was led by John Cole. So as a result of those groups, a number of significant sector and built environment changes and improvements have arisen in Scotland. This Grenfell action plan sits alongside this work and was a direct outcome from the phase 1 of the Grenfell inquiry. The plan was first presented to the Service Delivery Committee at the start of 2020, and progress updates were provided in the intervening time. The plan that's attached today contains 44 recommendations that were derived from phase 1 of the inquiry, and these relate to the wider UK fire and rescue sector, but also directly to London Fire Brigade. I can confirm that the 44 actions have been considered by the service and have been processed and closed. There's one action that has been removed and moved to another action plan, and that's moved towards the CCF action plan because it relates to the interdependency between command and control systems across the D-Light sector. The appendix attached provides each recommendation along with the evidence which supports the closure of those actions. I think it's fair to say that quite extensive work has been undertaken to ensure that SFRS fully considered and acted appropriately in response to each of the recommendations. And these don't just relate to the built environment, but also look towards training, operational policies and procedures, resources and equipment which we use at high-rise incidents. I think it's fair to say to date the engagement with partners through the auspices of the Ministerial Working Group has been absolutely invaluable in progressing the legislative and regulatory changes that we've seen in Scotland. There's also quite a strong example of where the service have influenced outcomes, so the inclusion of sheltered accommodation and the subsequent production of sector-specific guidance was as a result of the service lobbying through that, and I don't think that would have been able to have taken place had those forums not been set up. I think it's safe to say that this in no way represents the end of the Grenfell work. Phase 2 of the inquiry is still underway, and we continue to monitor that and reacting to any outcomes from that, and we'll anticipate the report coming forward in due course. Alongside this, we'll continue to develop and improve our own high-rise policies, procedures, training, etc. And to also further inform this, an external review is currently underway by the HMI in terms of our response to Grenfell and where we are with high-rise. I think that should be published in the very near future. Chair, I'm happy to pause there and take any questions on that.
Leslie. Oh, sorry, Leslie.
I'll defer to Nick.
Yep, thank you. Nick, please come in first.
Oh, my apologies. I didn't mean to talk over that. I just want to reinforce something Stuart has said there. This report, as it has come to the board on Stuart's updates on every time I give an update, but has been presented in detail to the Service Delivery Committee for some time. And the committee members have consistently expressed praise, really, for the way in which the service has listened to what has gone on, taken an action plan of actions that are directly relating to the wider UK fire and rescue services, but also this comment about acting in the spirit of a recommendation, even when it was specifically pointing towards London Ambulance Service. I was and have been extremely impressed with the way in which we have, or Stuart and his team have looked at those recommendations, and then I thought, how could we possibly learn from this, and how can we adapt that to the environment within Scotland? And I think that's worth noting. And if we're talking about taking levels of assurances away from briefings, I and the committee have got a high level of assurance on that, the work that Stuart and his team have been doing. But I just wanted to really make that point public.
Thank you, Nick. Leslie.
A similar point, and I would only say that the action plan came in as COVID came in, and the continuing focus that Stuart and Ross and many colleagues across the service kept on implementing the Grenfell action plan was admirable. The work has been very heavily scrutinised, and it's been excellent. So I just leave it there. Thank you, Kirsty.
Thank you. Paul.
We'll start. Firstly, Chair, can I just formally declare an interest? I'm actually retained by the Metropolitan Police Service as part of the criminal investigation to provide advice. I think the board should be aware that this is very much phase 1, and I know Stuart said this, but there is clearly going to be a phase 2 report, which will be considerably larger than phase 1, and will have numerous recommendations, I'm sure, which will affect the fire service, as well as what they'll say about manufacturers and design process. And although perhaps there is going to be a bit of a lull for the next year, I think there's going to need to stand up again this committee, or this structure you have, probably in 2024, when that sort of thing comes around.
Just in terms of that structural point, Paul, we're going to retain that structure because we've seen the absolute value of that cross-directed work that's went into this. And we also want to recognise that incidents happen in the built environment in the UK and across the world on a daily basis. So we want a forum that can capture that and then progress actions within the service without having to wait for other things to come through. And there's a real connectivity with national operational learning now that Stuart is within the service as well. So we're able to readily share that information. So those structures will be in place. Clearly, the volume of work that goes through there will depend on when the phase 2 comes through, but just to provide that assurance.
Pleased to have that assurance, and I assume that that's also being done at a UK-wide level as well. Yes. And that we are playing our part to pick up what might be coming up.
Yeah, so we're very active in the NFCC forums that support that work as well, Paul.
Thank you.
And for wider information, and the minute Paul's interest is registered and is non-conflicting. In fact, it's a real strength for our board to have somebody with that level and depth of experience that they can bring to the table. So we can note that. If there are no further questions on that section, that brings us to the end of the committee reports and allows us to move on to item 11, the Combined Risk and Performance Report, Q4. And that's a report for scrutiny, and over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Kirsty. It's going to be something of a double act today with myself and Chris Fitzpatrick, who's online. Because this is a Q4 report, what I've asked Chris to do is just to give us a quick overview of the year on some of the PIs that sit within the report itself. You know we've committed to doing an annual performance report as a service, but just because it's the end of the Q4, Chris, these will not be yet official statistics that we're talking to, because we're still going through that final end year process, but it will give a sense of not just the quarter, but what's been occurring across the last year. So Chris will come on and talk about that in a minute or two. But in terms of the report itself, just a couple of things that I would want to draw out before we invite Chris in. In terms of strategic risks that sit within the report, we had a discussion similarly, Brian, at SLT a couple of weeks ago when we were discussing the risk register, about how we can move on in terms of its usability, if I could put it that way. And the team, David Johnson's teams, again working with Chris in terms of the BI team, business intelligence team, about how we can support them in that next iteration and evolution of it. But the discussion at SLT was very much it's because we have improved our approach to how we deal with risk management within the service over the last few years. We're now at a stage where it's the finessing of the formatting we're talking about rather than the substance. So I think that was a very positive discussion. And then equally what I would say that reflecting in the last year, what I've also seen both at directorate level and I think across executive boards where I sit is a maturing of our approach to how we're discussing and dealing with risk. So at each DMT and at each executive board, it's a standing agenda item, and there's much more engagement around risk than probably I've seen in previous years, and I think that's something that's welcome across the service. We're also using risk spotlights in a much more systematic fashion. And for example, Lynn gave one at the Good Governance Board a couple of weeks back on the financial position. And what I've seen over the course of the year, both there and the digital board where I sit as well, is that not only do you get the head of function coming in and giving us all that background depth to the issue, etc., but invariably the conversation is turned to how other parts of the service now contribute to how we mitigate against those risks. So that corporate approach to understanding risk is something I think continues to mature. So while we've got here a limited number of risks within the report, it's that assurance, if you like, that there is a much more active approach to risk management that sits behind some of these numbers. This report maybe gives credit to, and again, I think that reformatting of the core risk register may help us in that regard as well. In terms of the annual operating plan elements within the report, there are 27 actions in the EOP. 14 have been completed on schedule this year. 13 are going to not complete, and again, details of the reasoning behind some of that sits within section 3 of the report, plus the revised timescales. Those items in the EOP that have not been concluded will continue to sit within the EOP for next year as well, so that the board have got ongoing oversight of the delivery of those actions. But again, we can maybe pick up on any questions from board members on that. In terms of those sections, section 3 and section 4, again, we've seen progress. So in terms of section 3, those items carried over from last year's EOP, 7 out of the 13 actions have been completed. The rest, again, will be retained within the EOP until they're concluded so that the board can see where they go. But again, to give you a level of reassurance that the message has gone out to all heads of functions and all directorates that those actions have to be prioritised and concluded. And again, it's with what's coming down the line. We don't want to have legacy issues hanging over this while we start to reframe the service around some of the issues we talked about with the resource spending review. So we'll hopefully see those progress very quickly in the first part of the year towards conclusion. And again, in section 4, that residual EOP, which is the more historical element of actions, 7 out of the actions have been completed, 5 remain overdue, and again, revised deadlines are there contained within the board. But again, to give you that reassurance, the emphasis has gone out, we need to get these actions concluded as a service. We don't want to be carrying EOP actions for any longer than necessary. So that message has gone out across the heads of function, and hopefully again, as we get into Q1, you begin to see some of those actions fully concluded. In terms of the corporate measures, again, I'll not talk much because Chris is here to talk about it. What I would say is that overall, perhaps the message is we've begun over the last year to see a return to normality in terms of operational activity through some of the performance reports. Not universal across the piece, but that's probably the key message coming from it all. Availability remains an issue, as you can see. We've got 2 of the PIs that are on red that relate to availability. But again, as board members know, we've stood up the tag, or the stag, to give it its proper name now. And again, that remains a key focus within that group about how do we do work in order to ensure that availability figures can be improved. But we all know the background to some of the challenges that sit behind the availability figures that we're looking at the moment. So with that, I'm going to pause. I'm going to ask Chris to come in so he can talk us through some of the performance side of it a bit more, and then open it up to board members and questions and comments.
Thank you. Chris?
Oh, assuming his ICT works.
Yes, we'll give him a second or two to get his mute off and hopefully join us.
He's having an issue getting off mute at the minute. There seems to be a technical fault on his side.
Some technical issue. Right.
Okay, so we'll just take any questions from board members, and hopefully we can get Chris.
Hopefully he can
technology sorted out.
Get online. Questions relating to the performance report. Malcolm, please come in.
Yeah, thanks. Malcolm Payton, board member. I thought both the format and the content was very helpful and very clear. It was good to bring in the stuff from other, historic stuff or whatever as well. That was great. So thank you for all of that. And the one bit that did leave me totally baffled, to be honest, was about on page 115, where in the pathway to green, the same sort of sentence is used twice, where it says priority consideration has been given to the resourcing challenges and continuity across functions and working group members in recognition of the impact on time and quality. And to be honest, I read that 3 times. I'm still not sure I'm any wiser. But I just wondered if we could get a little bit of clarity. I think I know what it's getting at, but just a little bit of clarity of what we're seeing there. And also, actually, is that actually a next step? Could we have? Is there something a bit more concrete we can say there about what we are actually doing? If you see.
Yeah. Okay. We'll make a note of that, Malcolm.
All right. Okay. That's fine.
Thank you. Angelina.
Thank you. So I start this question with an apology because I have a horrible feeling this issue has been discussed before. I cannot for the life of me remember the answer that we got, so I blame a spot of post-COVID brain mush. But the issue relates to 2 of our measures. It's 1.1 and 1.3, so that's our home fire safety visits and our accidental dwelling fires and fatalities. And the question is the relationship between those 2, and very specifically, do we cross-analyse the location of ADFs, etc., with the geography that we know we have undertaken the home fire safety visits in, if you see what I'm trying to understand. So it's about impact effectiveness, which is always important, but particularly in the context of the first issue we spoke about this morning, the whole resource spending review thing. So it's a kind of impact and analysis question I'm trying to get at.
And it's probably Stuart's area.
Yeah. So in terms of the fire investigation report highlights all the issues in terms of where we've had contact or not with individuals, and it also looks at the background in terms of SIMD data and things like that as well. But there's also a subsequent case conference process that's carried out following every fatal fire that involves partners to understand the root cause, underlying causation factors and things like that, to ensure that we both develop strategy, but also make sure we develop pathways with partners in order to generate referrals. And also that work is done as part of that. There's a bigger piece of work at the moment that needs to be done and is underway in terms of effectiveness of the home fire safety visit and how it's targeted and delivered. And that will be getting presented, some of that, to the Service Delivery Committee at the end of August.
Thank you. And may I
please come back
and sneak in a supplementary? So if, for example, so that sounds really, really valuable work, but if I were to ask, for example, do we know what proportion of homes that have received a home fire safety visit subsequently become the site of a fire?
Yes.
And all those kind of tunes that one would play on those metrics, do we have those numbers?
We do.
Right.
Okay. Can I maybe just add one piece to that as well, Kirsty? We're also looking at this more from a data analytics perspective. And there's again joint work between my team and Stuart's team when we're looking at how do we do some predictive modelling round about where the fire risks materialise. Again, that's very early stages. We're in conjunction doing some work with Glasgow University on that, but we're hopeful that that's another tool that we'll be able to add into this, where we can actually run some algorithms within our data that begin to give us pretty accurate predictions of where are the likely highest risk fires to occur, so that again we can use that as information that helps target whole fire safety visits, stroke safe and well as that matures. So that'll be in the background as well over the next couple of years.
And Stuart's.
I was actually going to come back in, but I think I'll bring David in if that's okay, just to talk about the CRIM model and how we use it, utilise that to target. So.
David Lockhart, Director of Service Development. So you'll be familiar with some of the development of the Community Risk Index model that we've produced. That takes the 5-year data from 2015 to 2020 of all incident types, but specifically related to accidental dwelling fires. That plots all the incidents, geocodes them within our ArcGIS mapping system, and we then overlay that with Aecon household data that we've purchased to identify the different types of individuals that live within these dwellings, and we can then replicate that across Scotland to identify where there is the likelihood of this type of individual, this type of dwelling environment being subject to an accidental dwelling fire. We then are about to progress with Stuart's Directorate Service Delivery, the provision of that information to then allow them to inform where they would deliver the home fire safety visits of the future based on historic data in terms of incidents that we've attended. So hopefully that gives you some assurance as well that it is built into that model. But and then ultimately the output of the model will be how we utilise that as an organisation to review our risk and demand going forward, and how are we align our resources to that in terms of that preventative activity, but also that operational response should an event occur.
Hugely helpful answers, everybody. Thank you.
So we've got loads of people wanting to come in. I'm going to first check with Tim what he wants to come in on while I to help me make the decision about where to go next. Tim, is yours in this area or is it on a different topic?
It's on a different topic, actually,
I will
Chair.
ask you to hold on for a second then till we explore this bit, and then I will come to you next.
I think we've got Chris online, so I don't know if we want to.
Fab. Right, so Fiona's on a different topic, but it looks like Leslie and Malcolm are both wanting on the same topic. Is that the case? Malcolm first.
Very quick one. You said that the data was from 2015 to 2020, I think. At what stage will we be able to update that or look at data beyond 2020?
We are currently going through the process of cleansing that data from 2020 onwards. We are conscious though that was during the COVID period and will not necessarily align to the norms that we've seen before that. So we need to be extremely cautious upon how we make any decisions on that specific data set. And the preferred option is to utilise the previous 5 years of 15 to 20 until we have greater understanding of what the trends will look like going forward. And as Mark's already made reference, we are seeing that return to pre-pandemic type levels, not across all incident types, but across the majority. So we will consider it, but we need to be cautious in terms of that.
What we'll need to do, just in the specifics of that, Kirsty, is we'll make a statistical adjustment to the statistics to account for the fact that there's that disruption over that 2-year period. Because again, in future years, when we go back to do the historical analysis and set baselines, we need to account for that. But the team are already on that, and we'll make sure that those adjustments are there, and therefore it doesn't destabilise the core of the CRIM model in future years.
Thank you. Leslie?
Thanks, Kirsty. We have a good performance management framework, and I note that we have a very good performance management framework. I note that we will be reviewing that in quite a lot of detail this autumn, so that we can make sure it really well reflects the new strategic plan. I do anticipate that the board will want to get more measures in this particular area because it's so critical for our prevention work. And at the moment we've got input measures because that's what we have. But it's been a topic of discussion, particularly within the Service Delivery Committee, about getting in about the effectiveness, exactly as Stuart says, and it will be important for the board to determine and conclude which PIs it wants relating to home fire safety visit for implementation 23-24 onwards. Thanks, Kirsten.
Yep, and I believe that's part of the process that will automatically flow from the review of this, well,
Yes.
the implementation of the strategic plan, those new indicators.
Triggers the review of the
and
performance
targets.
framework, so you're right, Leslie, we'll kick that off in a few months.
Okay.
And board members will be fully engaged.
Thank you. We have Chris online, so before I go to Fiona and Tim, I'm going to invite Chris in to see if there's anything additional he would like to add.
Sure, I think it's on continuing issues.
Oh,
did
you? I saw it flash up on the screen. I thought resolved.
Obviously scared them with those two questions.
Yeah. Oh, well, we will remain on the screen and we will go next to Tim. Tim, please come in.
Thank you, Chair. Tim Wright, board member. I start off by saying the quality of, I know it's been said before, but I do think the quality of the reporting is excellent. It's come such a long way in the time that I've been on the board. So well done to Mark and Chris for bringing that stuff through. If you'll forgive me, I'll just want to make one general observation, and then I do have a specific question. My general observation is that once again we seem to have a particular action that is delayed by in-house ICT development, and it's a trend that just keeps coming up again and again. And I question why, when we know there are resource constraints in that area within the organisation, why we continue to persist with internal developments and the delays that almost inevitably seem to go with it. But so that's a kind of general comment that I shall just throw in
we
there.
will note that, Tim. Thank you.
Thank
Continue.
you. I did want to ask specifically about the non-compliance with mandatory cybersecurity training. I mean, my reading of this says that about 30% of the staff have not completed mandatory cybersecurity training. That, quite apart from the fact that the specifics, that worries me a lot, particularly at a time when we're doing more and more remote working and expanding the attack footprint of the organization. But I wonder, are there other mandatory training courses within the organization that have that level of non-compliance, or is it specifically that one? And given that I've asked about ICT things and my concerns around that, you'll forgive me my final pedant question, which is the implementation of the Wide Area Network 4.3. Should have been done in March. We're told we're going to be done by May. We're now almost in July. I wonder if somebody could confirm to me that, not necessarily today, but whether that work has been completed, because I'd rather not sit and wait until the next board meeting to find out whether it's been done. Sorry, rather a long rambling question, but that would be, I'd be grateful to hear about particularly non-compliance on training. Thank you.
Yep, we will come to that second, if that's all right. So I'm going to go to Davy Lockhart, particularly around the 4.3 wide area network aspect.
Thank you, Chair. Dave Lockhart, Director of Service Development. Thank you for your question, Tim. And whilst I don't know the exact detail of when that wide area network implementation will be completed today, to give you, I will get that information for you, and I look forward to having an off-table discussion with you in regards to your views on the questions and the points that you made. Hopefully that's acceptable for you today.
Okay.
Absolutely, I appreciate it. It's a complete pedant's question, but it just really reflects my area of concern, and so I'd be grateful if you could follow up with me. Thank you.
Yeah, and so we will note that very clearly, and I'm going to go to Andy. We've only known each other for 8 years. Andy, to pick up on the training aspect.
Thanks, Chair. Andy Watt, Director of Training Safety and Assurance. Just in terms of that mandatory compliance of the training modules, in the main, the majority of them, those mandatory modules within the training for operational competence framework, and we report that on a quarterly basis through the People Committee. And there are some challenges around about some of that, as we know, in terms of compliance, but in the main, the majority of the mandatory ones are actually quite well, level of compliance is at an acceptable level. There's improvements to be made. I think the cyber security training is a little bit lower than the rest of the mandatory ones that we have. I can run a report to get the exact figures on that, but that's my understanding is the challenges around about that. And I had a discussion at SLT yesterday around about this in terms of what we can do to potentially change our delivery model or do something different to get a higher compliance rate within the cyber security training. I'm going to pick that up with David in terms of ICT and the training, learning e-development team to see what we can do with that. I mean, just in general on that point with cyber security, as Andy said, we discussed it at SLT yesterday. So we're sitting about 82% compliance at the moment. So what we've been doing is the ICT have been generating the figures for us across each of the directorates. Where are we in terms of their own compliance? Now, some of that, kind of 18-19%, is people who are off long-term sick, and therefore they still count against the non-compliance, even though they can't actually engage in the training themselves. So not all the 18-19% of people who are kind of sitting there not doing what they're supposed to do, if you like. So what we're doing is, say, working with each of the heads of function, providing them with the information to then cascade to the managers, to then speak to the staff involved to say this is a mandatory programme. You have to do it on an annual basis. And again, what we've picked up through some of the comms channels is a bit of confusion. People think, well, I did it last year. They didn't realise it's an ongoing annual process that you have to renew their ticket. So again, we'll be putting out communications on that. And as Andy said, we also had a discussion yesterday about potential changes to how we run some cyber training with people in the future years. So we are looking at it. And again, the message has gone down through the heads of functions to the frontline managers. Please engage with your staff and make sure they do this, because clearly the rest of the organisation of failure on a cyber security issue, we all know where that can take us, and therefore we've been pushing that quite heavily over the last couple of months to staff. So their compliance rate in the last 6-7 weeks has actually improved significantly, but there is ongoing work that's required, as Andy said.
Okay, so I'm going to note what Andy said about we think that there is a lower level of non-compliance or a higher level of compliance for other areas of training, but we'll get a bit of a note sent round the board just so that they can see that. I know that's within the People Committee's area, but we'll get a wee note just for the board's assurance specifically around that. But keeping, before I go to other topics, keeping on that, I think both Brian and Leslie indicated that they wanted in, I think around the note. Are you content now, Leslie?
I've got an additional point, please, but it's in the same area.
Okay, Brian, were you wanting in specifically on that aspect?
Well, yes, I think it is, Kirsty. I was just wondering, I was trying to make a connection between this issue of cyber training non-compliance to some other issues. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I talked earlier about the failure to declare interests. We have also seen, certainly at the Audit Committee, examples where central policies are not always applied equally out in the field. And I just wonder, in thinking about non-compliance, whether we need to think about whether there is anything which is systemic in the organisation that represents some sort of barrier, whether it's cyber training, whether it's registering an interest, whether it's compliance with policy at the local level. Because I don't know whether it's something cultural, but there's certainly, I have a sense that there is something which is just not working properly in terms of the centre effectively communicating the message. And you know, I think you could probably look at things like fraud training, which is being rolled out. So I wonder if there's possibly something, a slightly different layer of inquiry that needs to be undertaken.
So I guess there could be a connection and something systemic, or it could be that our human brains like to see connections between not terribly related things. And I guess we don't want to commission a large amount of work to find it or address a problem if we don't know what it is. So Stuart, do you have any thoughts or reflections on what we might need to do to test out whether we think there is a connection here or not?
Yeah, I mean, there is multiple processes within the service in terms of what gets done at a local level to audit standards and compliance with policies and things like that as well, you know. So I'm not sure if it requires a wide-scale piece of work at this stage, Brian, but I'm happy to pick up with SLT colleagues and have a discussion about that. Mark's furiously waving his fingers, so perhaps Brian.
On a separate but related issue, when we went through the whole process of GDPR, and we introduced a new policy, the GDPR, we put in training for people about how do you now deal with data with that in mind. We then followed that up by doing some station audits, where we specifically went out and worked through it with the stations and checked what they were doing. And what came back from that was a very strong, reassuring message about compliance, and we sample checked across the whole service. So we had a balance of whole time RDS stations in different geographies and so forth. And I took that as quite a, because I was sceptical, which is why I asked the team to do that kind of audit process, because I thought people would be looking to game GDPR, because this is all just the central bureaucracy gone mad kind of thing. But I was surprised at the level of compliance that we achieved in GDPR. So I'm not sure it's systematic, but there are areas, or certainly pockets, I think, of policy where there's probably more we can do to engage with management to ensure that they fully understand the requirements and they're discharging their functions. But I don't get a sense that it's been systematic.
No, no. It sounds from various things that it doesn't sound like it is. Can I suggest, just for board colleagues' wider assurance, that we pop an item on the agenda for integrated governance that reflects this, and we can have a conversation between the chair, because that's what the integrated governance forum is there for, is to look to see if there are common themes bubbling up. Let's have a bit of a conversation there and test out, just make sure that this is one or two exceptional areas rather than something that's a bit more deep-seated, if the board are content with that approach.
And if I may add, Kirsty, I am not suggesting there is anything systemic, and I certainly wasn't suggesting, you know, a resource-intensive piece of work. It's more about having it in the consciousness as you're looking at things.
There's perhaps a kind of root cause issue in terms of how we communicate, share information, and ask people to put information. And we know that people don't always read things that we put out, and we know it's a challenge. We know that Mark and the team are working through how they might develop that. So if there's an issue, it's probably more around about how we provide information and how that's accessed, Brian.
That would be my guess.
And
again, link that back to the review of the intranet and the web discussion. You know, we're out to the process of procuring a supplier to redevelop board. And one of the themes that we'll run through, particularly for the intranet, is how do we personalise it in a way that makes it easier for people to engage and also get the relevant information that they need to know that they're part of the service, as well as the more corporate elements. So that's a theme running through that again. I think hopefully that will help, because you know, we're a large national organisation, and that brings big challenges, as we know, in terms of communication. But it's something that's certainly on the radar for the service.
Andy, do you want back in again?
Yes, that's okay, Chair.
Yep,
just probably expand a little on Stuart's point around about making it accessible for people. So we've implemented a new delivery model for the training for operational competence framework in Q1 this year, and the anecdotal feedback has been very, very positive, and it provides more flexibility and autonomy for local managers to deliver over that period of time. And I think there's an opportunity to look at some of this in the round, if that could tie in with how this seems to be landing at the moment, to make it easier for people.
Yeah, because absolutely we want to make it as easy as people to do this, so that it's not a we don't want to say there's some kind of non-compliance issue, if actually what we're talking about is the organisation not making it easy enough for people to step in. Absolutely. Do you need to say anything anymore on that?
No, just quickly, I was just going to come in. Sorry, Ian Morris, Acting Director of Asset Management, and follow my sort here a wee bit, because most of the ones in compliance are on my team, and these are ones that are not on computers. They're drivers, they're stores, they're mechanics. So try to get them off the shop floor at the moment is the challenge. Well, we've still got heavy workloads on top of them. Okay. So I'm happy to take on board. We're having conversations with them, but they don't operate the computers at the time. So when they come to do the training, it's taking them twice or three times longer. So it's taking them 3-4 hours to do the training to get the pass rate. So that's where the challenge comes from. I'm happy to take that one.
It's also a low risk with those people.
They're not on the computers all the time.
Yeah.
That was very helpful, thank you. And we'll take it to integrated governance for a bit more discussion, just to make sure that we're content. Leslie.
Thank you. It was continuing with the ICT themes. So this is on page 133 of the pack, and it's item 4.2. So it's the item that Tim spoke about a few minutes ago. It's relating to the addressing of the vulnerabilities following the penetration testing in July 21. So I note that I think at the time of the report it says 25% of high vulnerabilities hadn't been resolved by mid-March 22, and I just wanted some reassurance that there is, well, I wanted to know how that was being focused on, really. It just seems high vulnerabilities, obviously, you would want to address as fast as you can.
David.
David Lockhart, Director of Service Development. So in relation to this area, we are working through the areas from the pen testing. They are progressing well, as my understanding at this time. Unfortunately, we've had a notification of a resignation of our cyber architect, and this is going to create additional challenge for us as an organisation. However, we will look to deal with that as quickly as possible, but I will provide further detail back to yourself if that's acceptable.
I appreciate the offer. Don't worry about the further detail. I think just the reassurance I'm seeking is just that we're focusing on finding workarounds to address the issue. We've got even further reduced resources in this area. So I just want reassurance that it's really being prioritised, just given the risk around cyber attack.
Absolutely, it's what the main priority for ICT in terms of making sure that the service is safe in that regard, and as I say, that the areas that were identified are progressing, and I hope that we'll report a positive outcome in the next quarter report.
I'll look forward to that. Thank you.
Right, and we'll give you more than 2 days in your job to be able to.
Exactly.
Thank you. Fiona, thank you for your patience.
I did have one question about cybersecurity, but they've all been answered. So the other one is dead easy and very generic. Amber in the RAG status says slightly off track. Somebody define slightly.
Where there's a target, we use, as you know, rolling 3-year. Rich is in the background, so you can correct me when I get there. Inevitably, I get it wrong. So, we use rolling 3-year basis to calculate the targets. So, I think it's if we are, was it within 10%? 10%. So, if we're below 10% to the target, that's what we classify, yeah.
Target timescale.
Again, depends on what the indicator is.
Right, yeah.
So, each of them have got their individual target base, which is based on a 3-year rolling average across the data period. So you take each indicator, you go back over 3 years, what was the average that we achieved? You set the target from that. If we're within 10% of that, that's an amber.
Right.
If we're less than 10% or more than 10% of achieving the target, it's a red. That's the basis.
I just find it deeply ambiguous.
Okay, so
that's
as part of our performance framework review, we can have a look at the language we use as part of the report as well. Get a bit plain English.
It's a bit like the definition, legal definition of reasonable, isn't it?
There's a different.
That's a reasonable conclusion.
Thank you.
Thank you. So those things noted, and with the action around making further discussion at integrated governance, we have thoroughly scrutinised that report. I will allow you a break shortly, but I'd like us to do arrangements for reviewing the effectiveness of the board first, please. And this is a report for decision, and we will require approval or otherwise. Can I invite Mark to orient us to that and then invite questions?
I'll be very quick in the orientation. I think the report speaks for itself, Kirsty. But what I will say, just as part of that, is that since very early stages of the service, the board in its various incarnations has taken the review of its activities and its effectiveness very seriously. And in our 2 best value audits from Audit Scotland, that was picked up as a very strong theme from the service. Last year, as you know, we had Deloitte in doing their wider scope work, and yes, they came back with a couple of recommendations for how we can improve governance, one of which related to public access to meetings during the pandemic period. But they also noted in the report again the strength of governance that runs through the organisation, particularly relating to how the board functions. So I think we've got a very strong record here. I think Appendix A gives some of the kind of high level detail of the activities the board has taken over the last year to review its effectiveness. And again, I think it's just testament to that ongoing commitment to improvement of the board itself. So I don't want to say any more than that, but clearly board members want to ask questions or comment or think there are things that are missing from that appendix, and clearly happy to pick that up. But I think the record speaks for itself, I think, as a board, and I'm confident that the next time we get a best value audit, I think we'll have ongoing commentary from Audit Scotland to that effect.
Thank you. Any comments or questions around the review of effectiveness? Can I just pass on my thanks to board colleagues and to our board team around the work that we've all put into this area. I think this is an area where we are pretty self-reflective and self-critical around trying to improve and develop. So, and I know there's a lot of work goes in to make sure that we are on that continuous improvement journey from what I think is a pretty strong base.
Yep.
So thank you to those who are busy doing all the work in the background. Okay. Stuart, please come in.
Hi there. I suppose I had a slightly different take on this, in that it all just reads as if everything's rosy in the garden. And I do wonder whether we really think that, in that there are no criticisms, there are no negatives, there are no actions. And I can think of a number of things that we've discussed over the piece about reporting, around size of meetings, around papers. Particular issue that we've discussed is around how does the risk thread run through everything that we do, and how are we comfortable that we're covering all of that off. I suppose another question I have in my mind is how do we, when we meet, are we clear that at what point we're meeting to give direction or discuss strategy versus scrutinising things? And I mean, these may just be issues that are in my mind, but I just felt the report was just a little bit glowing.
Okay, so that's a really useful challenge. I guess for me, some of what we are reporting on here, the processes that we go through in order to identify those kinds of issues that we then need to address, rather than necessarily talking about the issues that we're continuing to work on, would be my take on it. But I absolutely get where you're coming from, that it is more about, it's not necessarily listing the areas that we are working on. So, yeah, Mark, bring you in first.
Yeah, and again, I agree. It's a very useful challenge, I think, for sure. But what we didn't want to do is replicate the detail in this report. So, by reference, for example, to the wider scope work, that's where we've set out the detail, both from the auditors, the challenges that they have laid down to us, not just in governance, but Stuart's absolutely right in terms of financial reporting and so forth. The action plan that then sits behind that in terms of our responses there, that's scrutinised through committee as well. So rather than replicate the detail, what we're trying to do here is show this is the kind of a high level story, but there is more beneath that. So if that's something we need to correct, then I'm happy to kind of do that for the historical record, because you're right, there are issues that we have confronted, and you as a board have confronted and dealt with over the last year or so. Maybe this is a bit of a rosy version of it, but I think if you dig into the reports that underpin each of these areas, I think that's where you see some of those issues come through, rather than say provide the detail in this report. But I'm happy to go either way on that.
Brian, and then Fiona.
Yeah, I think it's a very helpful challenge, Stuart. And actually, I think all of us, well, certainly me, have probably fallen into that kind of sense of security, because we are good at what we do from a governance perspective. But your thought triggered a thought in my mind, is that the example that you gave, that risk thread, it's not evident. We're having a workshop to talk about it. So, and what's also missing here, which is fairly typical in such reports, is a specific action plan for improvement. And although I accept, Mark, that there are maybe elements of that held elsewhere, there maybe is a case to pull some of that high level stuff into an action plan, do a little bit better in terms of risk scrutiny would be one item. I don't think there'll be many items, and I'm not saying that we have to do it, but it's just a suggestion.
Okay.
Fiona?
I was just going to endorse what you said, Kirsty, because I read this and some of exactly what Stuart said ran through my mind. And then I looked at it again, and it's the arrangements for reviewing the effectiveness of the board. Is the paper. That's what we're being asked to look at. And if you look at it like that, I completely get it. Doesn't mean there's a lot of other stuff that we clearly need to be talking about and doing to improve effectiveness. But it's the arrangements, so it was just to emphasise that point.
Yeah, and I do think the fact that we are able to identify these things as issues is an indication that we are reviewing our own effectiveness and have actually got a list of things elsewhere. So perhaps that's something that we need to be thinking about, specifically commenting on in the review, are where we are picking up some of those aspects. Because I'm aware, for example, that things around risk appetite is on our forward plan. We've already done a session, we've got more sessions. The length of papers, for example, and the fact that they don't always get to the heart of it is part of the plan that the board support team have got to try to address that. So I think we do have some plans about how we're going to improve the content, but it's not properly reflected in this report. Do you want to come back in again, Stuart, before I bring in Steve?
Only that, if that's the purpose of the paper, then that's fine, but it would be good to actually have a discussion around some of these issues specifically, and how and what are we doing to address them, if indeed there is any need to address them.
Yeah, so let's flag that, because I think that would be a suitable topic for a strategy day, to make sure that those things are very clearly visible to board members, because I'm aware of the various plans and bits of paper that are followed up and how those feed in, but perhaps the visibility isn't there otherwise. So thank you, and very useful challenge. Steve.
Thank you, Steve Barron, board member. I think Stuart's challenge is an important one, and it's given me some cause to reflect on this paper too. And the question I have is whether or not any of the board members, the chair specifically, I guess, were involved in the development of the paper. And I feel that a paper with this title should have involved board members before it comes here.
Okay, so I certainly saw this paper while it was being developed and have discussed the activities within this. I guess it's here for discussion at the board is the way to consult on the paper, rather than it necessarily coming in another format, although we do review our own effectiveness usually at the board away days, so there are opportunities at that stage to look at it. But point, and the questionnaires that inform those discussions, but point well made, Steve, around making sure that we're fully engaging at all stages. So let's add that aspect to discussions that we'll have when we talk about how we present papers and how all board members are cited on the review of our own effectiveness. Brian.
Yeah, I actually, it's not until you have this conversation that you actually look at the title of the paper, because arrangements for reviewing is about the process rather than about the outcome.
Absolutely.
But surely the outcome is more important. Well, the process is important, but the outcome of that process is particularly important. And where do we have that reported? If we going forward, change this to reviewing the effectiveness of the board rather than the process of reviewing the effectiveness, perhaps that's what we should be looking at.
So yes, I think those are two different, but obviously very clearly connected aspects. So let's have a think about that.
I'm just going to say, if we take it into a strategy day, I think that's a very useful forum to discuss, because probably a bit like yourself, I get to see the totality of things through the various bits of work that go on. And I think probably we are a bit fragmented, so the idea of whether it's an action plan or whatever we call it, that brings all of that together in a single place where we can show the outcomes of the work that's going on, including the assessments that committees make themselves, their effectiveness, that all feeds into this. So how do we corral it all together to show the outcome? That's a really good question. So if we take that into a strategy discussion, we can start to think about it and plan it and build it in for next year. And again, take Steve's point about how board members are involved in that process as well, because ultimately it's your judgment, it's not ours as the executive. So I think it's a really useful strategy day discussion, and we need to reflect that for the year ahead.
Yeah, and of course, although in many ways it's a self-reflective task about how we are performing and what difference it makes, it actually does need to be a kind of 360 judgment. So getting feedback from the executive is important, but also we clearly have feedback regularly from government about our effectiveness through the annual performance review.
Yes.
So, you know, we are getting a number of different sources of information, and actually having a little bit of a map of that would helpfully inform that discussion, and I can see Richard's cogs going already about how he's going to support us doing that. So thank you for those challenges. I think we've got the potential for a different paper next year that possibly talks both about the arrangements and the outcomes and tying that together. Thank you. So that said, I'm going to suggest that we take a break and that we come back together again at 11:45. That gives us hopefully enough time to refresh cups, and I will see you shortly. And that's us restarting the meeting. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming back so promptly. And that takes us into our next item on the agenda, and it's the revised terms of reference for the Employee Partnership Forum. And Steve, your name's against this online.
Thank you, Kirsty. So again, Steve Barron, board member. My role in introducing this is as chair of the Employee Partnership Forum. I'll give a very brief introduction, I hope. Firstly, thanks to Ali and Richard for their help with this. Most of the changes, most of the revisions to the terms of reference are housekeeping. They are updates, catch-ups with new changes in titles of other groups and general housekeeping items, but there are two changes that I'd like to bring to your attention. The first is in section 2, which states that the chair will now be a non-executive member of the board, whereas previously it was on rotation between the non-executive and a representative body, someone from a representative body. Now, given the new format of the forum being focused on discussion of big items, big issues, to bring forward recommendations for others to consider, there was general agreement within the forum that it was worth trying to allow everyone around the table to make a good contribution to the discussion, and that would be more easily accomplished by having a non-executive director in the chair. So we are proposing to try that for a year, review it in a year's time. So I hope I have your support for that. The other change I bring to your attention is at section 5, bullet 7, which deals with holding private workshop sessions and makes specific reference to short, medium and long-term working groups. The meeting that was held on the 19th of May was a very rich discussion on gender diversity and inclusion within the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. And as a result of the richness of the discussion, there was support for the establishment of a short life working group to take that forward over 3 meetings over 3 months to enable more detailed discussion to take place. So I've started to set that up, and I would like the board to give authorization for that to happen. Hopefully I have your support for these things. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to confirm, I'm very supportive of both of those recommendations, both the specific change to the terms of reference and to support the short life working group. It seems to me to be building on the really constructive work that's already begun under Steve's leadership. So any other comments or questions? Or happy to support both aspects? Intent, excellent. Thank you. That is approved. Steve, thank you very much. The next item on the agenda, item 14, SFRS Communication and Engagement Strategy. That paper has now been withdrawn. There's a couple of areas around focus and content, as well as some discussion around the process that it needs to go through before it comes back to us for approval. So it's just to inform those colleagues that that work's going to go on off table and it will return to us at a later date, if you're happy with that approach. That takes us into the finance section of our paper, and we're going to debt write-off. And Lynn, you're going to take us through that. Welcome, Lynn.
Thank you, Chair. Lynn McGeoch, Acting Head of Finance and Procurement. I'm here today on behalf of John Thompson, the Acting Director of Finance and Procurement. And the first paper I have today is, as you said, the debt write-off paper. The purpose of the report is to request the Board's approval for the debt write-off in the financial year 21-22 for a total of £3,719.21, to be exact. The total is made up of 3 items over £1,000, and per our financial regulations, as you'll know, it must be approved by the Board for write-off. Some of the background to this is the debts are the result of employees leaving the service while still owing money. However, the paper does have more details on that. All actions possible have been taken to recover these monies. However, the debts are now time barred as they are over the 5 years old. In accordance with our accounting standards, IFRS 9, as detailed in section 3.8.1 of the paper, we would request the Board's approval to write off the debts in the financial year 21-22. As I say, further details of these amounts are in the paper, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Ryan, please come in.
It's just to say this came to the Audit Committee yesterday, and we discussed it and concluded that the Board should approve this. Or we would recommend the Board approve it, sorry. That's what I meant to say.
Thank you. Continue to approve. Thank you. That is approved. Continuing with yourself, Lynn, Resource Budget Monitoring Report, please.
Yeah, thank you. So the next paper is the Resource Budget Monitoring Report, with purpose to advise the Board of the resource budget position for the period ending the 31st of May 22. As at this point, we are reporting excuse me, a current underspend of £64,000 with a forecast year-end overspend of just under the 1.5 million. As a point to note, this forecast position is based on the additional funding being received to support the services investment in ESMCP. Some areas to highlight in the report are budget variance, financial risk, forecast and budgeted savings, which I believe is coming to the Board for the first time today, so the information is within the pack. The variance, there are 3 variants in May to reallocate budget between travel and subsistence and realign budget allocation following some staff changes. The summary table within the report also gives details on the variance in the year to date, with the main changes to reflect staffing information at the beginning of April and increase in budget allocation for utilities and further price increases and movements for facilities management in line with a continuation of additional cleaning due to COVID purposes. The main financial risks that we would highlight here are that we are reporting an overspend, and there is the risk overall that this will materialise in the financial year. This is particularly around pay awards, as we forecasted a 2% pay award, which is obviously dubious at the moment, and therefore anything in addition to that 2% will put challenge and pressure onto the budget, and that will be effective in the current financial year as well as financial years going forward. In terms of the overall forecast, the main variations relate to employee costs, property and transport costs. We're currently forecasting an overspend of employee costs of just under the 1.5 million net. The majority of this is driven by whole-time costs, with 2.167 million forecast as an overspend, mainly driven by the fact that we remain subsequently below the TOM. The overtime forecast is just under the 6 million, which is obviously quite significant, albeit this is being offset by 3.8 million underspend in whole-time vacancies. This is a real challenge, obviously, for the service. However, we do have a variety of mitigating actions in place to assist with alleviating the risk, including lots of cross-directorate collaboration to manage the risk, Also, we have, the areas like the staff and tag group and the operational availability group. But I'll turn to my colleague Stuart. I don't know if you want to get into more detail of these groups at this point.
I'm happy to wait until then and pick up any questions.
Thank you. Excellent. There's questions on that. I'll refer to Stuart. So to offset some of the overspends, our retained is forecast to underspend at 467,000, and support staff forecast to underspend around the 226,000 mark. These are helping the overall employee cost position. Two other areas to mention in regards to forecast is firstly property, and we have some good news in the year that the rates bill is lower than anticipated due to the local authorities maintaining the 2% increase rather than the 4% that we had originally anticipated. We giveth and taketh away. We therefore saved money in that, however that has been taken up with transport costs and the increase in fuel prices, and it's pretty much pound for pound where we've saved. We have had costs incurred. As I say, the final area now to mention is Appendix C, which is new to the board. It gives details on how we're doing in terms of the budgeted savings. This was part of the Deloitte wider audit action, and it's to allow us to give more focus on our budgeted savings. The overall forecast is we are looking at just over £6 million of savings compared to a budget of 5.88 million. Our two areas of concern, and they're highlighted in red in the table, are that of transport costs due to the fuel price increases and also agency staff costs, but these are being mitigated by more support staff savings. Overall, in the savings arena, we are doing reasonably well, and we're managing the budget, and that will continue to be reviewed as we go on throughout the year. But happy to pause at that point and take any questions.
Please, comment or questions for Liz? Yep, please.
Thanks, Lynn. That was a helpful summary. Thank you for that. And I particularly welcome the reporting of the savings progress. Great to see that coming through. A couple of questions. Firstly, how are we contingency planning to stay within budget despite the potential for a more than 2% pay award? And secondly, I'm just curious, and I may just have missed something obvious, but why are we wiring out of staff resourcing when we're also expecting an overspend in staff resourcing? So those two questions.
Okay. I'll start off with the staff resourcing, if that's okay. It's around the line of the kind of skills gap in the area where we have people that are vacancies, but we're also then bringing agency staff in to be able to cover that area of concern. So there's a bit of, it does in first impressions look a bit strange, and I appreciate that, but it's down to these areas where we're trying to manage the staff. The contingency planning, as I say, we do have kind of a variety of different action groups that are on hand just now through the pension remedy, etc. All of the challenges that we're facing just now, but as I'll refer to Stuart here that could probably go into them in a bit more detail, but that's to help us work within our budget in the current year.
So I suppose the bottom line for me is that whilst we're forecasting an overspend, we clearly do not. We're doing everything in our power not to overspend. I think that's the key
Can I maybe just elaborate on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, please.
If that's okay. So the pre-arranged overtime is a significant challenge given the shortfall in target operating model we've got. In fact, we need to pay time and a half to cover that point. So the forecast is a worst case scenario as we should be, and we're putting a number of mitigations in place to control that. It is an unprecedented set of circumstances. We've come off the back of COVID, which impacted our ability to recruit, but also to train in terms of specialist skills. So that was an impact on that. Hot on the heels of coming out of COVID, we were faced with the pension remedy issue, which was unplanned and unforeseen, and that has had a significant impact on the leaver profile. You can see it in one of the graphs within the chart that the number of retirals against the number we expected is astronomical. On top of that, the OPRR, so that's the bank hours we have to bring people in, was severely impacted this year to the tune of 36,000 hours by the additional public holiday for the Jubilee. So that really impacted on our ability to bring people into the organisation. So, and then we have the skill shortages issues as well. So collectively, it's presented a real perfect storm, Leslie, absolutely. So in terms of numbers, we're seeing around about a deficiency of around about 300 from the target operating model which is unprecedented as well. So in terms of response to that, we've established the tactical action group in terms of staffing, which I chair at the moment, and there's a staffing solutions team which sits beneath that that's coming up with a number of quite innovative approaches in order to plug those gaps. And then we've obviously got the availability group that meets regularly around about that as well. So that's a cross-directorate group. A significant amount of resources being put towards that. In terms of some of the actions to mitigate the shortfall in the TOM, we're looking to bring in inter-service transfers, so those who are already in the UK Fire and Rescue Service who can come in. That's positive because they come with skills as well. We're increasing the number of trainees that we're bringing into the organisation, and Andy and the team are working really hard to increase the capacity of trainee courses, and we're doing we're building a migration process which will allow for the first time our colleagues from on call in the RVDS to transfer into the whole time, and we're just working up around the detail of that. And I think that's a really positive step for the organisation in terms of creating that pathway from the retained into the whole time, because that also supports the retained, makes it more attractive for people to join it. So it meets a number of the agendas that we're trying to do. Our ambition is obviously to try and get a blend of new entrants, skilled colleagues and competent colleagues as well, and that will help mitigate that. And we're hoping that will all come online over the course of the year and subsequently mitigate the pre-arranged overtime issue as well. So essentially what I'm saying is please be assured that we're managing this, and please also be assured in terms of the spending review, that's also at the forefront of our mind in terms of decisions that we make that need to be future-proof as well. So hopefully that gives some sense of the mitigations that are in place.
It does, and you gone through a fantastic range of stuff, Stuart, and I get the impression that you're absolutely on it, and that is fantastic. And just to kind of close the loop then, from a board point of view, we can't have a position where we're planning to overspend. Yeah. So in future reports to the board, we would expect to see all the great work that you're talking about feeding through into a forecast overspend that is zero.
Absolutely.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. Mary.
Thank you. I mean, to some extent, the perfect storm is the point. I think I just want to drill down a little bit on, Stuart, because I guess you can deal with one of these aspects, but it's when you're dealing with multiple versions of them, it's the fragility within the system that I'm getting increasingly concerned about. Because we've talked, obviously, at the People Committee about RDS, talked about recruitment and retention, talked about the pension, but actually when you start to see it all coming together, and then when I saw within the report as well reference to sending whole time out to cover RDS stations just to maintain availability, I guess it's how close are we to the edge in all seriousness in terms of staffing levels and stuff at the moment is one point, and the second point is, are there opportunities to make SFRS a desirable place to relocate from other fire services within the UK, and how close are we to getting to a point where that might be possible?
I'll bring Liz in on the second point, but just in terms of that first point, I'll not sugarcoat it in terms of this is a difficult and really challenging position they're in, Mary. There are a number of other levers we can start to pull should we need to do that. We're not at that point at the moment, and before we got to that point, we'd obviously re-engage with the board around about some decisions that need to be made. So I'm comfortable at the moment that the work we're doing is working towards where we need to be. But as I say, it's a very, very challenging situation. I can't quantify how close to the edge we are. I'll just reiterate that it's very challenging.
So on the other point, as part of this work stream, one of the key things that we're doing is really developing what a model would look like moving people into the service, so making it easy for them to do that in the first place, because we had quite an onerous process before. That has now been reduced and simplified. We are also building in attractive things such as relocation packages and so on, and selling the areas where we are probably attractive to people outside of Scotland. So perhaps the more rural areas tends to appeal to people that want to actually relocate to Scotland. So there's also an advantage in that the cost of housing in the south is higher than it is in Scotland, so people get more for their money. So actually it is a better balance. The one area where we do sometimes struggle is in the more senior positions, because the salaries are often higher. but we've been internally pushing our development so that we've got a better succession plan of leadership roles, and that has been reaping rewards. Unfortunately, that is going to be quite significantly depleted with the pension remedy challenge, but what we've done is we are currently reprioritising what we do in the leadership development area to escalate some of those leadership development processes that we put people through to create a better pipeline of mainly middle managers, it has to be said. So it really is a holistic approach that we're taking to this. We're looking at it from every angle. We're also looking at the abatement issue in terms of pension and how we can make that attractive to people, because as we know, people retire from the fire service relatively young. So they often, well, nearly always want to do other things. So we're trying to tap into the people that we now know are in this pension remedy process to say, what is it you're intending to do once you retire? What can we do to bring you back in? Not necessarily to do what they were doing before, but to utilise the skills and knowledge of the service that they've got. So that will probably be a really helpful pipeline, because it will be attractive to people to do that, and it means they can get the benefit of the pension without any detriment in terms of coming back to the service. So it's a really holistic approach, but we are absolutely focusing on this as the priority area in the service. And the thing I would like to really say is that this has created a huge demonstration of how well directorates are working together. Everyone is pulling in the same direction with us, so that is helping immensely.
Please come back in again.
Yeah, I think a lot of that's really encouraging, and we're aware of a lot of it already through the People Committee, and the work that's being done is in outstanding, certainly in some very exemplary places. I think there was there's still a concern though in terms of the risk level at which we're running at the moment, and trying to get some quantifiable way of interpreting exactly where we're at, I think it would be useful for my reassurance anyway. I did have a point, but COVID's driven it entirely out of my head, so it can't have been sufficiently important to remember. So I'll leave it at that point, and hopefully I'll remember at some stage.
And can I perhaps, just adding to that, there was a conversation, as the chairs of committees will remember, at integrated governance, talking a little bit about the fragility, potential fragility, and how we might cope going forward if, for example, we were to have industrial action. So and there's going to be some preparatory work being brought to the board so that we can understand that. Can I suggest that we mark that piece of work includes an attempt to quantify the degree of fragility that we have and how any future change might impact? And that could come initially to integrated governance, but perhaps actually is something for wider discussion with the whole board once it's been for knocking about. Okay, thank you.
Kirsty, my apologies. Can I just ask a quick question so I can understand it correctly? Liz, you said that the salaries were higher. Were you referencing that the higher level posts were higher level payments further south than they are here in Scotland? Have I got that correct?
Yeah, in the main, they tend to be from sort of area commander level upwards. We do find a challenge there that our salaries are less attractive, and given the size and scale of what people have to take on here versus the simplicity of the role that they have comparatively in the south, because it tends to be much smaller brigades. Now, it's not a absolute uniform, because we have actually managed to recruit people, but we often find that that's unappealing for people, given that they know it will be probably a more difficult role.
Yeah. I'm aware Stuart on the screen's wanting in, but Brian caught my attention on this topic in particular, yes? Or is it different? Okay, in that case, I'll go to Stuart Ballingal on the screen, please, first.
Hi there, thanks, Kirsty. I just had a quick question. I'm just trying to get my head around the risk in terms of the 6 million of saving that's been projected. Is the saving spread evenly across the year? And therefore, if we looked at today, have we banked what we're looking to bank? And does the ragging relate to our confidence on delivery for the full year number, or relate to where we are today? i.e., are we comfortable we're going to deliver 6 million across the full year? Is an easier way of putting it.
Absolutely, we are, and we are looking at that on a month-by-month basis when we're doing the budget monitoring. between our decision support and our key players, business partners across the service. So that's something that they communicate with each of the budget holders to ensure that we're working towards that. We can get a picture at this point, I don't know at the top of my head, but I can get a picture of where we are sitting against those savings for the year. That table primarily gives the forecast, but it can give us just now, where are we sitting just now against the whole year forecast. I can absolutely provide that if that would help.
I don't need that detail. I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable if you're saying that's where we are. That's fine, thanks.
Yeah, you just need you to know we had it rather than actually see it. So that's
it's just really the risk in the number. It sounds like we feel quite comfortable that we're going to deliver that 6 million.
Yes, we do.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Could I just make another comment?
Yes.
Just following on what Leslie said about delivering a balanced budget, and I obviously I completely agree with that, but I wouldn't like to see reporting coming to the board just zeroized for the sake of presentation. I'd like to see it warts and all of where we are.
Yeah, absolutely, and that entire transparency. We do not want reassurance, particularly not false reassurance. We want the absolute facts. So thank you, Brian.
Thank you. My point was also on the savings figures, and it's more an observation, perhaps looking forward. I'm not sure this table does in fact address the entirety of the Deloitte recommendation, because from memory they talked about efficiencies and being able to separate out efficiencies as opposed to savings, which are underspends on budgets. Over half of the 6 million is a one-off, it's non-recurring, but I don't obviously see items in this table which make me think they are the product of a considered efficiency plan. And I think, particularly given what we know about the resource spending review, that has to be part of our strategy going forward. And it's really just to get some assurance that it will be, and there will be thought given to what I would describe as true efficiency planning going forward, and time and effort invested in that, because that is part of a sustainable future for us.
And can I just say that I absolutely agree with that. And before meeting this morning, Stuart and I were having that very conversation. We need real efficiencies, recurring savings and not non-recurring, so that we don't end up slicing off little bits of the organisation forever and not actually being able to bring about a long-term sustainable organisation. And having a conversation along a similar line with Mark and Liz in the last few days, I know that the whole SLT are united in that, and we will hold them to that.
Excellent.
Which part?
I like that holding feet to the fire.
Any other comments or questions? Please.
Just to give again Brian a wee bit of reassurance, there is an element in that you'll see there within the utility efficiency programme in the set of 415. That's actually been, if it wasn't for the investment we did over the last 2 years on the solar panels and the various elements of the carbon reduction, that would actually be sitting probably $1 million over at the moment with the current. So what we're doing there is we are mitigating and reducing the unit consumption, but the unit price is going exponentially high with inflation and various other elements. So it gives you a false representation of what the actual efficiency drives in there. And that element has been recognised for the front end. You know, we're using the greener stations competitions and various elements at the front end there who are actually embracing this to try and lower our costs. So there is some good examples of efficiencies out there which are probably not coming out in the actual totality of what we're actually doing there with regards to the figures.
Thanks, Ian. That's a very good point. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Kirsty. Could I raise something? It's not about a substantive issue. It's part presentational, and it may be something, Brian, that your committee are quite comfortable with, in which case I will withdraw what I'm about to say. But if I look at, let me just take an example. It's a reference to the risks, and my sometimes fragile grasp of the language around this is that when a risk has actually crystallised, it's no longer a risk in our language, but it's an issue. So 2 examples. One of our red risks relates to pension remedy.
risk that the number of full-time retirees may be significantly greater than planned because of da 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 da. That's surely our initiative. I've been listening up, and similarly, one of our major risks around recruitment, a risk that the timing of recruitment, both for uniformed and support staff, may be different to the forecast, causing changes into da da da. Surely we're beyond risks here. So I just am asking, is that, you know, have we thunk all that through, and is that a deliberate retention of the language of risk? Or is there mileage in reviewing how we're now presenting these things as actual, a reality rather than a risk that we're scenario planning for?
I don't
See what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
I mean, yes, come in first, Brian.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And anytime you want to join the audit committee. Yeah, be careful what you ask for. I take this as
issue committee.
I take this as a bit of a shorthand, and we're using risk just to highlight, because I guess an element of it is still a risk because of the quantification of it. But your point is absolutely correct. But
I'm happy to take that back to the decision support team, and we could potentially look at how we reword that and represent it if it's something that would be more beneficial. We have the risks and clearly identify where the issues then lie, rather than it all being kind of lumped under the risk area. We can certainly look at that. If that would be helpful.
Or even not to get too complicated, but even, you know, we asked the risk about the risks that have actually crystallised or something, so that from a board perspective, we are clear about the match between real world and the language in the paper.
Absolutely, yeah. Good point.
I think that's a really, really interesting point. We've done to death how we present risk, and you feel as if you never get it right, but I think in our minds, when it gets to red, we're kind of automatically assuming it's there. But I do think there are different categories of red, because there are categories of red where we're much there is a real risk of it happening, but it hasn't happened, or there's one that has happened. So maybe we need to keep it quite simple, but highlight that difference. And I think in our minds as executives in all of this, we are still seeing this as we haven't hit a crisis, because our mitigation is managing this. So yes, it's red at the minute because it's really the hot topic, but we're still comfortable that mitigation is going to deal with it. But I think it would be helpful to have a bit of a flag to say we're now in this, albeit that mitigation is still managing it. But there's also something here about what the kind of probably top three things are, because we're in that territory now where we're saying all hands on deck for one or two big things. So I don't know if that maybe plays into it, but I would hate to overcomplicate it. But I think it's something as simple as a red with a flag says we're in it, but the mitigation is still making sure that we're not going to fall off the edge of a cliff or whatever it might be. Now that might change.
Crystallised
trade union activity, but
managed issues. Yes, and we should make that a purple. And I'm going to put trademark and charge people extra money when they add that to
excuse me, I've already done that.
No fighting.
I will defer as always to the chair of our risk and issues. Are we now content on that basis that we have thoroughly scrutinised that, and with the Fiona, I'm very sorry, you're quite right, you were indicating.
No, it's a tiny wee question, and I'm happy to be answered offline. It's in Appendix B under D, support, and it refers to employees working 100% on PT FAS being charged against the capital budget and have been excluded. I'm just looking for a quantum of how much we're charging against the capital budget.
I'll put that together and I'll take it if that's all right.
Thank you.
I don't know the figures just on the
Yeah, no, that's fine.
But no, it's important if we're capitalising that to know, because that's an area that we're going to be discussing, I would imagine, over the next few months. Yeah.
That'll be relatively easy to get my hands on, so I'll get that this afternoon.
Thank you. Fab. Thank you. Continuing with yourself, Lynn, capital budget monitoring report, please.
Thank you. So this is the last paper, actually, from me. It's the capital monitoring report, the purpose to advise the board of the position for the period ending the 31st of May 22. Also to highlight a request for approval of a legal commitment into the 23-24 budget, but I'll get into that in further details as we progress through the report. The main areas to think about in the main report is firstly the funding. The overall position is we have a 34.4 million for the current year, and we're currently in progress of moving forward applications for further funding in relation to net zero. That's, as I say, in progress just now with the Scottish Government, so therefore isn't reflected in the figures, but it's hopefully a positive outlook. We haven't had any environments in the period, and in terms of progress, it's a good news picture, and we are in a healthy position with 17.7679 million committed or paid to date, which is just over 51% of the budget allocation. Full details of the progress of that can be seen in the report under sections 3.4 and 3.5. We're forecasting at the end of the year as a spend to date and to balance the budget on the 34.4 million. We have added a new area into the report, which is including the RAG status of project milestones, which currently remains as green, and again further details are noted in 3.6.1 and 3.6.2 of the report. Our risk remains that the capital budget is insufficient to meet our asset needs, which will have an adverse impact on the condition and suitability of our estate assets. The final area that I had alluded to earlier there was to discuss it's around lead times of the kind of supply of vehicle chassis and subsequent body builds. Due to the current supply chain difficulties, this is extending beyond our annual cycle, and in order for us to maintain the supply, we require to financially commit 5 million of the indicative 7.5 million budget for vehicles into the 23-24 financial year. We have discussed this with Scottish Government and clarified that the board can sanction this commitment into next year's budget, and therefore we seek approval from the board. But I'll pass to Ian to potentially give more details if required and the kind of background to that.
I think it makes sense for you to orient us. Ian, thank you.
What I would say there is we're finding the supply and demand chain of everything at the moment, whether it's construction, raw materials, or the microchips is causing us issues across the piece. What we've now been informed from major fleet manufacturers, Scania, Volvo, Iveco, the ones we deal with, Scania have actually closed their books for 3 months at the moment, so is Volvo, to realign the production schedules. But what they have come back and said, if we place an order just now, it'll be 18 months before we take delivery of these chassis. So we've had discussions then with the bodybuilders, and at the moment the contracts are on with emergency ones, so there's nothing that I need to worry about there as regard to the recording of this. We've had discussions with them. They're equally anxious that they have, I think the number is 53 staff dedicated to our work streams at the moment. So they're also looking for a commitment from us to fill their production slots over the next year. What we've said to them there is, looking at the contract and working with service delivery and working with Stuart's team, we're quite happy to pre-order the chassis and pre-order commitment on the body build, so that their order books is then substantial for them to do their cash flows and their financial management with regards to that. Hence the reason we spoke to John, spoke to Lynn and the Scottish Government to say, in order for us to meet the production of us providing new vehicles to the frontline service, remembering we still have a £70 million backlog investment with regards to fleet, for us to continue that production process, we would really need to raise orders at the end of July, the beginning of August, to meet the deadlines and the production slots for the following year 23-24. Emergency One is happy with that. Volvo, Scania and Iveco are all happy with that process going forward. They're keen for them to get them in so they can schedule their production schedules as well. So that was the reason this came through as an unusual one going forward. The clarification from SG was, yep, if it's a board decision, we're happy with it, we're supporting of it going forward. And to be fair, it probably makes sense for the local economy to have these scheduled in there for that area as well, because it's the Cumnock area as well. So that's what the ask is for that specific one going forward. I'm happy to update any of the other projects if you want to now, or I can take that later on.
So I think if we mark that one now and check that the board are happy with that particular aspect, that would make sense, so that we can take this in small chunks and make sure that we're minuting. Are there any questions specifically on that before we decide to approve? Brian,
I have no difficulty with it. with that. It's just the way you need to do business. I'm curious about the Scottish Government confirming that it's fine for us to do that. I'm not sure it's for them to sort of say, but leaving that aside, I think...
Can I just check, is that in the curiousness, is that in relation to the fact, because effectively we'd be borrowing against future spend?
It was a flat cash state of £32.5 million over 4 years. What they're saying, that's what we're building in, because we can't carry over on the battle funds, we're going in that premise that there'll be £32.5 million capital next year.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, the only risk, because we're going to contractually commit to spending £5 million.
Yes.
So from a board perspective, are we satisfied that we'll have more than £5 million in the capital budget? And I think it's safe to say yes. I was just curious why Scottish Government were involved at all in that. But,
yep, please answer, Lynn.
I think it's just along the lines of the board would officially approve the budget for the annual year. It's that 1 year rolling cycle that we have, although we do have a kind of programme of work over the course of that time, and it was to ensure we were double checking the Scottish Government that we didn't then approve something that they would come back and say to us, you know, hold fire, you actually can't do that.
What we also do towards the end of every year, we tell them that we're legally committed grant the following year. That's normally properties, because the build programmes are over 2 years. Normally the fleet stuff, you can balance it and pull that lever to shut it at a stage, i.e. stage payment, and then recommit it. So this will be legally committed. Correctly what you're saying, we'll be legally committed for £5 million, which they probably weren't aware of, that would come through, because normally it's property. So the fact it's come through as fleet, it was just to make them aware of it, just in case they came back to us.
Do we want to ask our questions first before we get any more information on the projects? See if it evolves. No, please continue then.
Okay, I'll just quickly run through them. McDonald Road refurbishment project. I always feel like the Reverend I am Joe when I'm doing this going forward. Actually, it's sitting there at 90. It's finished. It's looking good. Not the museum. We do have. I'm going to pick up, because I know you the 26.4 externally completed. That's the defects. The building's finished. The problem we've got is the company that was the subcontractor that was awarded it to do the external claddings went into liquidation. So they have went through to do the remedial works there, the snagging work on it. They've now tendered, and that new company starts next week, first week in July, to do these snaggings on it. I took Mark through to have a look at it, because Mark had seen the old station, hadn't seen the new one. What we are going to suggest here, Chair, is that we're going to have hopefully hold an SLT meeting through there, probably July or August, and we're suggesting that we have a board meeting in one of the development days in there as well, so you can see the facilities for yourself going forward. And at that point, the museum, which is moving at a pace as well, is moving well, that should be nearing completion. It won't be completion until the end of July. The reception area has been changed. That won't be completed to the end of August at McDonald Road. But again, it is looking, I think it's fair to say, it's looking very impressive and very well.
It's a different station completely.
Don't jinx it. Right,
I hope so.
So it should be.
Seriously, yeah. West Ark, I'm just going to say, look over your shoulders, it's coming out the ground, and for those on the screen, we have got significant construction coming out the ground of the West Ark, and it's actually moving slightly ahead of schedule at the moment, and it's performing well. Again, the challenges what we've got coming back, some of the risks, is the Ukrainian, and there's the steel, and some of the inflation aspects of raw materials. There is an additional claim came in from the company. We are pushing back on that and asking to scrutinise it again. It's not substantial, it's still within the contingency element, but there is an element there which is coming forward. The fleet, as we spoke about the fleet there, it's moving a bit slower than we normally moved it, just because of supply chain issue, but they're still moving through the process. The ones that are planned for last year being completed this year and moving forward. The electric fire appliance that's been done, those that have seen it on social media, just to reassure you, the rapids on that at the moment is very Scotified, is a word probably for it. It's got a big salt tire across the front of it. It's over in Germany at the moment as PR, but it was funded by Transport Scotland. Emergency One got funding from Scottish Enterprise from it. There was various other Scottish elements that have been there, so they were over there basically showcasing the technology within the vehicle. So again, I can circulate the photographs of that if you want to see it, but be reassured that before it goes into operational service, it'll be Chapter 8, the same as any other fire appliance, and all costs associated with that publicity have been picked up by Emergency One. Nothing's been done with us, so we're picking up no cost of that going forward. But that's moving at a pace, and we're expecting to take delivery of that now this side of Christmas, which is probably about 2 months earlier. It will be down at the NACC, the national show as well, showcasing the technology in Scotland and showcasing the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service and the processes to take it forward. The PPE, as we've reported before, we've now got enough stock of PPE, or enough supply of PRE rescue equipment coming in, and over the next 18 months we will be replacing all hydraulic hoses, which then makes an ultimate safety aspect for the firefighters going forward. We'll know the horrendous injuries that Mr MacDonald had suffered a few years back with regards to a hydraulic injection. So that'll mitigate that risk almost down to zero. We won't take it, there's still hydraulic oil within the battery power, but almost down to zero. As we spoke about there, Stuart spoke about with regards to the high-rise stuff. We've done the smoke curtains and UIG, that's now been ordered. They're getting a replacement order. Smoke curtains and smoke hoods will come out in the Grenfell element as well going forward. ICT, again, are still experiencing the same, some supply issues, but they're moving them on with regards to their various elements. The rest of the capital projects, the PTF SAs moving at pace, the PPE and ops equipment I've spoke about there. We're just about to go to tender for the wildland fire PPE, so the wildland fire vehicles and equipment. The PPE has been concluded through an NFCC framework, and that's ready to go. And I think that's us. The other challenge we've got is regarding to the expansion of the EV electrical infrastructure for the cars. Again, supply and demand is pushing the contractors' limits to their availability to be able to install these, and we're having some challenges with the networks, the DNO sites as it's classed, Scottish Power and the other, the north one, I can't remember the name of it, but anyway, for putting the connections to the grid, there's some challenges coming off of that, but we are moving with them and working closely with them. And then happy to take any other comments on any other projects.
Thank you. So comments, questions, either on projects or of the overall capital plan. Stuart first, please.
Hi, Kirsty, thanks. And thanks for the update. Coming back to the 5 million, because I'm maybe just playing catch up here, but what we're effectively doing is saying we're going to approve 5 million of next year's spend, which is because we can't spend it this year, which is presumably giving us 5 million of additional capacity this year.
No, it's not that, Stuart. So I'm just going to get that additional information clarified, and then please come back in again.
No, Stuart, it's not. The planned finances on fleet will run this year as normal. What we're saying, for ordering us to be able to provide fire appliances in 23-24, because there's an 18-month or a 14 to 18-month delay in the delivery, we need to place the orders just now. So you're legally committing additional £5 million of next year capital. As you know, I would normally come in January.
Yeah. So we're spending this year's money as you intended to?
Yes.
Okay, that's
absolutely.
fine, thank you.
Yeah, it's a commitment we're making, we're not actually.
I was bothered about, I was thinking of this year actually. I thought we couldn't spend it this year.
Yeah, no, we can always
on that plan.
Well, on the screen, I'm going to pick up Mary before I come back into the room. Mary.
Yeah, there are times when I think he is a superhero, but I mean, in all seriousness, with spending review now out, when are we planning as a board to revisit our longer term asset management planning? Because I think I still can't reconcile the fact that we know that there's a massive risk in terms of that we just don't have the income coming in. It doesn't look over the course of the next 3 years that situation is likely to change in any way, shape or form significantly. I know that when we get around the table at the People Committee, we're constantly talking about the lack of dignified facilities, but that's having to match up against the lack of multiple other pressure points. And I think I'd appreciate an opportunity to revisit our prioritisation around some of the assets and asset spend and capital spend at some point soon. And I can see that Ian's probably wanting to come in because he's got it all planned already.
Yeah, so I'm acknowledging, Mary, that we need to come back to that. And again, it's not a risk that we're not going to have enough capital. It has crystallised, and it is an issue that we do not have enough capital. So we clearly are going to have to revisit that. Can I suggest that we pick that up within the conversations we have as a board about prioritisation, strategic plan, assets, all of that, and that we just make sure that we pick the capital spend aspects up within that, because you're right that although, yeah, we've got a fixed amount of capital coming in over the years as well, not just fixed amount of revenue, and that's going to have huge implications given current inflationary pressures. So let's pick that up there. Ian?
Just to underpin that, Chair, you remember that EJAS came along and did a presentation on the 10-year risk-based approach. That's now been written into a full-fledged document which will come to the board. The timing of that is probably going to be more aligned with the latest information with the spending review, because there is a direct correlation then on the resource budget and the capital budget going forward. So speaking to Ross, we've decided to bring that probably further down the line, that full report and the fleet report, the SAM, the Strategic Asset Management Plan for Fleet. There's one getting for property, so they'll probably come at the same time, and they'll identify all your issues with regards to investment of dignified, investment in contaminants and carbon and environment as well.
Thank you. Brian?
Thank you. And I've now got this image of Ian as Captain Marvel.
Maybe a big suit.
I'm sure we can procure that for you.
Shrek.
But I mean, given what we've said about the supply chain problems, it's a question around about our confidence of being able to spend that budget, and that comes down to the ability of suppliers to assure that they can deliver. And I genuinely struggle to see how suppliers who are dependent on suppliers can give us that assurance. So I just wonder, I'm sure you're confident at this stage, but we are in a different situation compared to any other time in the past. And I'm just be interested to understand that kind of process that you go through to try and squeeze out that assurance, and also what are the contingencies should that not play out? You know, can we go to Plan B, Plan C, and so on?
To be brutally honest, yeah, this is probably the worst year I've ever had with regards to the confidence levels of what we're doing. Anybody that knows the private sector, they'll promise the earth and deliver nothing, because they're looking to obviously maximise their order books as well going forward. So what we are doing is having deep, meaningful discussions with them, and I'll use that as a wee inverted there with regards to what they have in stock, what they can provide, and what the details is in that, and whether we see any slippages in our delivery process, and we build it into our programme to the 31st of March. So we always work back to the 31st of March when we're doing the capital plans. So we start to look at that to see where it's going. What we're also doing as well is putting in traction other projects which are on the same agreed capital plans that we've brought to use. So we're trying to see whether we can pull the levers that we have to bring some of these forward. I genuinely, we will get to the situation the 31st of March, we will have vehicles still in build that won't be completed, but we'll be bringing other stuff on it forward. We did that last year with the PRE, but it's getting harder because the whole industry is going forward. It's not just the raw materials and the microchips as well, it's inflation. Inflation at the moment, because even under the contractual procurement remits that we built in, some of them are coming back and saying, no, we know there's an inflationary clause in there, but it's not abnormal inflation, or it's abnormal price hikes in certain products. So they're asking us to say, no, we need to charge an extra 5% or 10%. And we're going to wait a minute, that's out with the contract. But we have had discussions with John and others to say, if there is visibility and pure evidence there to do that, then we're doing it. But your 32.5 million is basically the buying power of that has dropped considerably because of your inflation rates going forward. So to give you the reassurance, yeah, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, it is challenging. We're still confident we've got enough levers to pull to make sure that it's within the 5-year capital programme that I stand here in January with, that we're delivering for you, but we maybe be doing different elements at different paces.
Yeah. No, thanks for that, Ian, and I'm confident that you will do absolutely everything that you can do. I think it will be particularly challenging this time, but part of my thinking was given the uniqueness of this situation, which is not just being experienced in the fire service, but in every other organisation across the land, whether you have had conversations with the Scottish Government about the possibility of an underspend on a capital budget, and whether there's any flexibility that they can offer.
We've had that conversation with them. If there are any underspends anywhere else, I'll take it. But I've done it the other way about. I think, to give you again reassurance, we're over-committing on certain projects. We're getting them really teed up at the moment, and some of these are property dignified facilities projects. We've done the Inverness one there, and we're getting into phase 2 of that. So there are other elements there, so we're probably over-committing on our spend ability, knowing that we can either put a pin in it on the 31st of March and walk away if there's no financial capital there and it's job half done, but it's still fit for use, or we can continue into the next fiscal year with it. So that's what gives me that lever or that cat to make sure the cash flow balance between these is equitable, and it gives you the assurance for our board that what we agreed on the 3-year plan is what we are adhering to.
Do you want to come in, Stuart?
Yeah, and as, I don't know if Mark remember what's kind of around about the piece of research that we just had done, Brian, but with everything that's going on in terms of the resource budget and the capital budget, we need more levers available to us in order to manage the budget over a multi-year period. Because as things are at the moment in terms of large-scale change programs, with a 1-year budget, it's really, really difficult for us to do that. And with the challenges around the supply chains, our ability to roll forward capital would be. So we're having those discussions with Scottish Government now around about making those levers available to us. Deeply challenging, as you would imagine, but.
I think absolutely it's challenging, but I'm glad that you're having those conversations, because if you extend the logic of the multi-year indicative budget, it's about doing this, and there are so difficult, unusual, unheard of circumstances that it just makes sense to be able to actually enhance that indicative budget process with some. We'll never get hard budgets into the future, but we might be able to get some sense to be around about some aspects of the budget. Absolutely. Capital is a clear example.
Absolutely.
I'm going to suggest we don't extend them any more on that, because I think we could talk about it for quite a while, but I am aware that we're really quite tight on time today. So, Paul, thank you.
One very brief point then. You talked about we've got to consider the asset plan and we'll take it in with the other things. I actually feel that this issue is so significant that the board ought to have a separate discussion simply on the asset management plan, because we have identified so many key competing issues that you're dealing with. And I would welcome a chance for the board to actually say, possibly eventually into a public forum, that these are things we can't do because of the pressures upon us on the capital budget. So we no longer just seem to be, yeah, we can manage, we can make efficiencies, we can move forward. So if there are things we can't do, I'd almost like the board to have those options and to be making them public, so that we are letting down markers. And particularly in like dignified facilities, we talk about the RAC programme, we talk about the fleet renewal programme. So I'd like a separate session on that almost,
yeah. I think,
with options of what we choose not to do.
I think that's very fair, and I suppose when I'm thinking about wrapping it up within prioritisation, it's not that it'll just become wrapped in that. It's about marking that as a key strand of what it is we need to consider, and I think it would be entirely appropriate for that to be a private session of the board. So it would be a formal board session, but held in private, and then we can decide which bits of that we can make public and which bits we can't, because inevitably there are sensitivities within that, including commercial sensitivities. Does that sound like a sensible option?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. If we're happy on that basis, then to approve that, yes, to approve the report, and I know that there are a number of actions within that which we will make sure are captured. The next section of the agenda are reports for information only. We're going to have a very brief orientation to these, and I'm not going to allow an extended discussion, because these are things that have come elsewhere, and I will flag that as we go into each one. The Health and Safety Annual Report went to the People Committee on the 21st of June for scrutiny, and was circulated more widely to board members before coming today. Andy, would you like to say a few words on that?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, absolutely. As previously mentioned, conscious and acknowledged to get here through the completion of the report and the government's route to get here, and we're working on the revised timeline for next year's, this coming year's annual report. In the main, I think it's a very positive report in terms of across all the KPIs. They're all on a positive trend apart from acts of violence, and also seen a 12% increase in terms of the completion of the health and safety annual improvement plans. I think our health and safety performance remains strong in a UK context when benchmarked against other fire and rescue services. as is contained within the report. I think the context is it covers that period of the pandemic when it was at its height, and the Health and Safety Department was not just delivering that business as usual element of health and safety, but also the COVID arrangements that we put in place over that period, which some of which were seen as best practice for the HSE. So I'd just like to thank the team for that. So really high level overview of the report, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Any specific questions on that? While people are making their mind up, can I remind us, or should probably say, can I welcome the revised timetable for next year around this? Obviously there's been significant drift, and that's something that the People Committee agreed would not be repeating itself, and thank you for acknowledgement on that. And to remind board members that we are currently exploring health and safety training, leadership for safety, I think the course is called, which we're currently actively exploring at the moment, so that board members can undertake leadership training around health and safety and support us to be able to assess on a more informed basis how we are meeting our legal and other requirements as a board. Leslie.
Thanks, I'll be quick. A lot of positives in this report. I've already remarked on the huge achievement in zero ridders for the first quarter, and I know you're also just in post as well. However, I think when we are looking at a percentage completion of 59% of actions and health and safety action plans, and we're seeing that as really positive, I think actually no, I think that's not where any of us want it to be. Whilst the trends are positive all across the piece, mostly they're not in vehicle accidents, I don't think. So whilst the numbers going down, you can feel like the number of vehicle movements, actually the rate of vehicle accidents is deteriorated. It's good to see the benchmarking. However, I'm unclear as to why there are so few forces benchmarking, especially in Ridder, and I would hope to see benchmarking across other areas in future, and I'll leave it there, Kirsty, given the time pressures. Thank you.
Thank you. So we will note the desire for wider benchmarking if we can going forward, and the vehicle accident numbers. I have to say this is an ongoing issue. I don't know how many times we have visited, particularly slow speed and reversing accidents, and it's just one that we cannot lose focus on. And I know we've been working incredibly hard on it, but it just needs to keep going. Content to move on to Performance Management Framework Annual Report, and again that came to a board strategy day in December 2021 and is here for more information today. Very briefly, Mark, please.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. At that strategy day discussion, if you remember, we agreed we would take the report away and put some contextual information against each of the indicators, not to lead the reader to a conclusion, but just to give a bit of explanation. This is what this particular indicator tells you. So we've concluded that with the report, and therefore it's here for board members' information. We'll continue this into next year in terms of doing that annual performance reporting. We're comfortable with.
Content to receive that for information. Yeah,
thanks. Just a couple of, one is just a practical point, but there's a very light grey sort of colour that's used, but it's pretty well unreadable, and I tried printing out as well. So we talk about accessibility and equal access and things. I think, can we just be a bit cautious if we're doing stuff that is really quite hard to just, so if you could note that.
Make allowances for elderly eyes.
Something like that, absolutely. And the other thing, I know we've often talked about the idea of competence and the way the word competence is used, and I know we've had that explanation, absolutely understand it, but it still worries me when we have a published document that says your operational core competence was down 72%, and I just wonder if at some point we can actually look at the wording, because I know it's about the currency of competence, and we've talked about and we understand what's behind that. I just think there's maybe a better way of wording it. Could we at some point look at whether we have to use the word competence for that? I think that would be helpful.
We can look at it, but I think that is a term that's used across the entire fire sector. It's got a specific technical meaning, my understanding, so that would make it difficult. But I'm sure Andy will reflect on that in his role. Thank you. We have had that information. Mainstreaming and equalities outcome progress.
Can I just,
sorry, Stuart, I missed you.
No problem. I quite like the format for this report, but I think when we discussed it last time, certainly my question was, how does this fit into the overall reporting and performance suite? It's just another report. And I thought that we were going to be getting a set out, or get set out, the various performance and reporting that we do across the organisation in a similar manner than the planning processes were set out. And I think that would be helpful, because it's very difficult to put that in that report in context without understanding what we're trying to achieve by it and what we're trying to report by it, particularly when some of the reporting timelines are really quite late when these are produced.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Mark. So in fact, Leslie is on very much in the same topic.
It is. I think it's a nice looking report, but it doesn't give us a performance in terms of what we've done in previous years. It doesn't give us a performance in terms of what our targets were, and it doesn't give us a performance in terms of what others are achieving. I know that what others are achieving is difficult, but the other two we have absolutely within our power, and I think you cannot assess the performance sensibly unless you know what's been achieved in previous years and what we were setting out to achieve. But I echo Stuart's point, we need to just look at our performance reporting and what how they fit together. Yeah.
Just on this report, if you remember with the annual report we provide to government for to support the annual performance review, there's no performance data as such goes into that report. So this was to plug a gap just in that specific point. But since we had this discussion in November in this report, we've had follow-on conversations with Scottish Government around our annual reporting. And we'll continue through to the performance review meeting in September with our current approach, but for next year they've agreed with us we move towards a single consolidated performance report. So we'll take this, we'll take the annual performance review report, we'll take the Chief's overview report, and we'll bring them into a single report for the service. So we'll use some of the infographic elements and all of that, because I do like them. It brings the data alive. Your point about trend analysis has been noted. I want to say we've agreed now with government that we'll move towards a single annual report. And again, we'll look at the timeline on that, because we have to look at when do we get official statistical data that can then support that performance report. So the annual statistical reports, they will continue, but we'll have a single annual
And next time,
yes.
Yeah, can I suggest that
we need to see out the current one with the current framework. Sorry, Kirsten.
And can I suggest that in the process of getting to that, when we get to the stage where we're introducing that, we detail and it's picking up Stuart's point to an extent, we detail what the existing performance reports are and how they have come together into this one. And rather than producing a report, say this is what it is when we're just getting rid of it, doing that narration of what we've had and how we've got to what we now have and how we've addressed those issues.
Yep.
Brilliant, thank you. If we are content with that, that takes us into mainstreaming and equalities outcome progress report. And although it says it's Lindsay, in fact, it's going to be Denise, I think.
Well, Denise is on the line. So given that we've got time constraints, what I was going to suggest is I'll just, you've read it, it's there. So board colleagues will be aware of our obligations under the Equality Act on equality matters. That requires us to set our ambitions every 4 years and to report on them every 2 years, but we update on progress every year, and that's what this report is there for, to inform the board of the progress to date and what is planned for the next year. There have been some constraints over the COVID period, which clearly with this type of work is obvious, but we haven't done nothing over that time, and there's been quite a good bit of progress despite that. Denise is there. I wasn't going to ask her to walk you through it in any more detail, but she is the E&D manager who leads on this piece of work, so if there are any questions I would defer to Denise, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And of course this is an area of work that the People Committee are very well cited on.
Yes.
So this is coming to the board for information because they do most of the scrutiny around this.
Sorry, that was just a question on it. In the governance route, it doesn't mention the People Committee, so I just wondered if it should actually be going to the People Committee.
So I don't know whether this paper has been to it, although I know that the work is absolutely done there. So it has, this paper hasn't formally been, but the work has been.
Yeah. it's part of the routine agenda that we cover at the
yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Mario, bring you in specifically on that.
I think Malcolm's made most of my point already. I think it would be useful to maybe have the paper coming for information to the people committee as well.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I'll make that happen.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you. Did you have another point
No,
as well,
no,
Malcolm?
that's fine.
That's it. Thank you. Yes,
Thank you. Just briefly, I just wanted to say how much I love the case studies. I think they bring the whole thing alive so beautifully. So, yeah.
No, that's great. Thanks to the team for pulling that together. But you know, this always does look fairly bland on paper, but the work that goes on behind the scenes is quite vast, and the team are really focused on that. So I'm sure Denise will take that back to the team.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thanks around that. Leslie?
Yep. Again, the case studies are fantastic. My question is, with apologies, is about process. Why have we got a report which is about case studies that doesn't also include data on how well we're doing? Because we're doing well. So again, it's why are we doing separate reports? I would expect a report on progress on mainstream inequality outcomes to give me the numbers and the case studies. So I'm happy to, given time constraints, to leave that sticking to the wall.
Yeah. You get any observations on that, Denise, or is that something we could take away and perhaps include in this report?
No, we absolutely could. I think it's the first progress report that we've actually done and that was agreed. And the reason that I kind of went the case studies route was a lot of the public sector equality duty consultation and stuff that's been around just now. Local communities are saying that we're too focused on the report and not actually on the outcomes. So given this was a progress report, we wanted to show the actual lived experiences of individuals, both as employees and as kind of our local communities as well. So, but there's no reason why we can't put data in that around kind of equal pay gap or whatever and tie it in with the reports already there.
I think it's a valid point. However, I would just caution to say that I hate to focus just on data with this because it can sometimes look really skewed, but I do take your point and I think we've got the data, so we could easily share it.
I share your concern of focusing on data, and I'm absolutely not arguing for that. I think a good performance report has got the data and the stories as well, and this is cracking on the case studies, absolutely cracking.
And there's lots of other good stuff happening. I mean, last week we brought in, I think it was 8 care experienced young people to do work experience with us, and they're experiencing everything in the fire service. And I just watched them walking around the building and they're loving it. They're forming a group together, they're experiencing, you know, the technical side of the roles, all the directorates. That kind of stuff is so powerful. And you know, I went to welcome them, and I just, you know, they were all kind of, you know, shy and reserved, and it's a fantastic opportunity for people. So there's lots of good stuff going on that everyone's involved in, and the amount of interest that the staff have in helping these initiatives is fantastic.
Absolutely, and welcoming that activity and noting that for future reports, it would be really useful to look at the balance so that we do have some data, but not losing the stories and the lived experience, which actually make it feel real. Thank you.
Thanks, Denise.
Lovely. Working in partnership, Mark?
Yep, again, I'll be brief. I suppose one of the recurring themes over the years for the service is how much work we do in partnership with others, yet we don't tend to celebrate it sufficiently well. So what we've done is we've set up a partnership and collaboration working group under the Good Governance Board, and Richard chairs it. And it's to help coordinate our approach to partnership, but also to share learning in some of the partnership activities that are taking place across the country that we're involved in, and then begin that whole process of recognising the partnership work, because some of it is nationally or strategically driven, most of it is driven from locality and community levels. So what the working group have done is, for the first time, begin a process of bringing together very high level information about the breadth and depth of some of the partnership work we're doing. We've built it in this particular report around our values. That's something we might want to look at in the future. But it's to begin that process of documenting the breadth of the partnership work that we're involved in, give some space, if you like, in national reports that show particularly the local level of work that's been led by colleagues throughout the country. And again, it's something that we can feed back into annual review processes and so forth going forward. So this is the first iteration of such a report. We've already got some ideas from SLT about what we might do with it in future years, but it's here for the board for information. And again, happy to take any comments on it, but it's going to feature further into the future as something that we'll do to document the breadth, the depth, the commitment to partnership with the service displays year in, year out.
Comments, questions? Content to note for information. Thank you very much. That takes us into risk themes. Has anything percolated up through the meeting that makes us think that there's something that we need to be considering that has changed in its level of risk? I know that we've noted a couple of things that are around risks moving into issues, but I don't think there's any change in the level of risk. It's just the nomenclature that we're talking about. Nope. Okay, thank you. Board forward plan, we have it tabled. Clearly there's substantial amounts of work there, and much of that is likely to be subject to addition and or change as we work through the next few months, and we're going to have a wider conversation about some of that in the private session that we're going into. So that is there for noting. Date of our next meeting, formally 23rd of August for our next board meeting, so noting that. And with that said, that allows us to close the public part of the meeting. Thank you to everyone who has attended and